Hey, welcome to Sleepy Old World. Before we begin tonight, one small thing. If this channel becomes a place you want to return to, if the voice and the stories and the slow pace of it feel like the right company for the late hours, would you consider subscribing? A like helps more than I can explain. No pressure. Do it when it feels right. Dim the lights, pull your blanket up, get truly, properly horizontal. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. A bedroom in Edinburgh, a kitchen in Ohio at 2 a.m. I read every single one. There is something I find genuinely wonderful about all these different people, in all these different places, settling in at the same time to hear the same story. Tonight we're going somewhere quietly extravagant, into the private accounts of women who had more money than most people would see in a lifetime. And I promise you, how they spent it will surprise you. Are you comfortable? Good. Let's go. It is the year 1883. The place is Belgravia, London, which is the kind of address that functions less like a location and more like a declaration. The houses here are enormous, white stuccoed, faintly cold in the November air, their railings freshly painted black by the kind of invisible maintenance that only very old money produces without appearing to produce anything at all. Coal smoke hangs in the upper air, and the street smells of horses and wet stone and, very faintly, of something floral drifting from the flower seller 2 blocks east, who sets up his cart every morning without fail, regardless of weather. Inside one of these houses at 9:30 a.m, a woman named, let us call her Eleanor, is sitting at her writing desk in her morning room. She's 34 years old. She's wearing a day dress in a deep plum silk that cost more than her upstairs housemaid earns in 4 months. She has a cup of tea at her elbow, a stack of letters in front of her, and a small leather-bound account book open to a page covered in her careful, slanted handwriting. She's doing what she does every Thursday morning. She's reviewing her spending, not nervously, not guiltily. With the calm, practiced focus of someone who understands that money, managed correctly, is the instrument through which an entire social world is built and maintained. Eleanor is very good with money. She's also very good at spending it, which is not the same thing at all, and the distinction is one we are going to spend a great deal of time with tonight. Let us begin at the beginning, which means, first of all, we need to understand who Eleanor actually is and what her money is actually doing, because both of those things are more complicated than they first appear. Eleanor is the wife of a man named, let us say, Mr. Pemberton, who made his considerable fortune in steel manufacturing in Sheffield and who bought this house in Belgravia 6 years ago as part of a deliberate and entirely conscious project of social ascent. Mr. Pemberton is clever and hard-working and has all the right ideas about commerce. What he does not have, and what he knew he did not have when he married Eleanor 12 years ago, is the instinct for social navigation that old money produces and that cannot be taught from outside. Eleanor has it. It came to her through her family, minor landed gentry with more connections than cash, which meant she grew up understanding every social code while watching her mother manage an inadequate income with extraordinary art. When Eleanor married Mr. Pemberton, it was understood, quietly and without anyone saying it directly, that his money and her knowledge were the bargain being struck. He would provide the funds. She would convert those funds into position, into the right invitations, the right connections, the right schools for the children, the right dinner parties attended by the right people who would, in time, open the right doors for the family's ambitions. This is what her spending is for. This is what her £40 a week achieves. I want you to hold that in mind as we move through the specifics, because almost nothing that Eleanor spends money on is for herself in any simple or straightforward sense. Almost everything has a social purpose, a strategic dimension, a role it plays in the larger project. Even the dress, even the cold cream, even the flowers on the hall table that she orders fresh twice a week from the same florist she has used for 5 years, everything is working. Let us start with clothing. because clothing is the first and most visible battleground of Victorian social ambition, and the sums involved are frankly staggering. Eleanor's wardrobe, maintained at the standard expected for a woman of her position and social calendar in the 1880s, requires what she would estimate at roughly £800 to £1,000 per year. That is her clothing budget, just for her, not counting the children or her husband, though she manages those purchases as well. £800 to £1,000 in a decade when you could employ a skilled craftsman for £1 a week, when a comfortable 4-bedroom house in a respectable part of London could be rented for £80 a year, when a governess earned £30 to £40 annually. She has a dressmaker in South Audley Street named Madame Le Maire, who's not actually French despite the name, but who has spent 15 years perfecting a French manner and a French accent, precise enough to satisfy clients who would never think to question it. Madame Le Maire's shop is a narrow townhouse, fitted out in the 1870s style, that was still considered the height of good taste in a certain kind of establishment, all pale walls and good light and chairs upholstered in something quiet. Eleanor has been going there for 4 years. She knows the fitters by name. She knows the texture of every fabric before she touches it. A single day dress from Madame Le Maire costs between £12 and £25, depending on the fabric and the degree of trimming. An evening gown, with its deeper skirt, its longer train, its more elaborate bodice, its lace insertions and silk ribbons, and sometimes the addition of beading or embroidery done by hand over the course of several weeks, can cost anywhere from £30 to £80, occasionally more for something intended for a genuinely important occasion. And a ball gown is a different category entirely. Eleanor does not buy as many pieces as a very wealthy duchess might. She is strategic. She buys fewer things and buys them better, which she has learned is the more sophisticated approach. A woman who appears at every social gathering in something visibly new is tacky. A woman who appears always in well-chosen, beautifully made, impeccably maintained things, some of which you have seen before and never tired of, is stylish. Eleanor aims for stylish. But even being strategic costs money. In a typical year, she might commission 3 or 4 day dresses, 2 or 3 afternoon visiting dresses, 2 evening gowns, 1 ball gown, and several lighter dresses for the country house season in summer. That alone, at Madame Le Maire's prices, brings her to the middle of her budget before she has bought a single accessory. And the accessories. This is the part that surprises people when they first encounter the detail of it. Gloves alone. Eleanor goes through gloves the way a modern woman goes through nail appointments. The etiquette of the 1880s requires that a glove be absolutely clean and unruffled every time it is worn, which means that kid gloves, which are the acceptable choice for any kind of calling or social occasion, are essentially disposable. They can be cleaned, and they are by the glove cleaner who comes to the house once a week for precisely this purpose, but they can only be cleaned so many times before the leather begins to show its age, and a glove that shows its age is not a glove that a woman of Eleanor's position appears in public wearing. She replaces her gloves several times a season. The annual glove expenditure runs to something between £15 and £25. Shoes. Eleanor's shoes come from a bootmaker in Jermyn Street and are made to measure. She does not buy ready-made shoes, not because ready-made shoes do not exist by the 1880s. They do, in growing numbers, but because made-to-measure shoes fit differently, carry themselves differently, complete an outfit in a way that the undiscriminating eye may not consciously register, but that the experienced social eye notices immediately. A pair of day shoes costs £4 to £6. Evening slippers, in silk dyed to match a particular gown, can cost as much as 8 or 10. She has between 20 and 25 pairs in circulation at any given time. Fans, parasols, handkerchiefs of fine linen with embroidered borders, a chatelaine hung with small, useful objects in silver, a small scent bottle, a card case, a miniature pencil, a tiny pair of scissors in a sheath. These things are not decorations. They're equipment for the social world. They signal, to anyone who knows how to read them, exactly who Eleanor is and exactly what category of person she belongs to. The chatelaine alone, a very good one in silver, could cost £15. The scent bottle, if it is from one of the established perfumers rather than something picked up casually, another 5 or 6. And then the scent inside it. Perfume deserves its own conversation, because the money Eleanor spends on fragrance tells a very particular story about the period she lives in. Victorian perfumery is not what we think of when we think of perfume now. It is not a bottle you buy at a department store counter. It is a custom relationship with a perfumer, often maintained over years, sometimes decades, in which your preferred scent is made and kept and reproduced specifically for you. Eleanor uses a perfumer in Burlington Arcade. She has a signature scent, a blend of violet and orris root and something duskier underneath that she has been wearing since she was 22 years old, and that her children, if you asked them, could identify blindfolded as simply the smell of their mother. She has it made twice a year in quantities sufficient to last 6 months. The annual cost is around £12, which again is not nothing. But here is the thing about Eleanor's perfume, or her gloves, or her shoes. When you add it all up against the total cost of what she is maintaining, it begins to look like a sound investment rather than an indulgence, because the alternative, appearing at a morning call with last season's shoes or a glove with a repair visible at the thumb, is not an option without social consequence, and social consequence is the one thing Eleanor's entire project cannot afford. Let us move into the house itself, because the money Eleanor spends inside her home is, if anything, more substantial than what she spends on her person, and it serves the same purpose in a more public and more immediately visible way. A woman's house in the 1880s is her primary social calling card. When she hosts a morning call, when she receives visitors for luncheon, when she holds an at-home on her designated afternoon, the house is speaking before she has said a word. The freshness of the flowers, the quality of the tea service, the condition of the upholstery, the way the light falls through the drawing room windows and what it illuminates, and what it very carefully does not. All of it communicates. All of it is Eleanor's responsibility. Flowers first, because flowers are the thing most easily noticed and most immediately tells a visitor where they are. Eleanor uses a florist whose shop is 3 streets away and whose arrangements she has trusted for 4 years, having auditioned several others and found them wanting in various respects. Too showy, not fresh enough, the wrong combinations for the times of year. She spends roughly £40 to £50 a year on fresh flowers for the house. The hall table receives a new arrangement twice a week. The drawing room has fresh flowers every day that visitors might be expected. The dining room on days when the table is laid for guests. The servants. Now here is where Eleanor's household budget becomes genuinely enormous. And here is where most people doing quick mental arithmetic begin to lose track of the scale. Eleanor runs a house with 12 indoor servants. This is not unusual for a house of her size and social ambitions in Belgravia in the 1880s. It is in fact more or less expected. To drop below 10 would begin to tell a story about the Pemberton finances that Eleanor has no intention of telling anyone. She has a butler, a cook, a lady's maid who is exclusively Eleanor's and serves no other function in the household, a housekeeper, a parlour maid, 2 housemaids, a kitchen maid, a scullery maid, a nurse for the children, a nursery maid who assists the nurse, and a footman. There is also a coachman and a stable boy who are technically outdoor servants and come under the coachman's wages separately. The total wage bill for the indoor staff runs to somewhere around £280 to £320 per year. which sounds like a lot until you understand what those 12 people are producing. They are producing collectively the seamless, apparently effortless running of a large London house at the standard required for Eleanor's social position. The fires laid before anyone is awake, the breakfast on the table at the correct time without anyone having to think about it, the drawing room clean and fresh and properly arranged before the first morning caller might possibly arrive. The children dressed, fed and occupied in the nursery so that Eleanor can conduct her morning social administration without interruption. The silver polished to the standard where it reflects clearly enough to see your face in it. The linen laundered, ironed, folded, pressed and returned to its drawer or its cupboard without anyone having to ask. The coal ordered, delivered and carried upstairs without making a sound or leaving a mark on the carpets that the housemaids have already beaten clean. Eleanor thinks about the servants the way a good conductor thinks about an orchestra. She does not play every instrument herself. She does not need to. What she needs is to know exactly which instrument should be playing at which moment, to have recruited people who can play their parts well, and to have created a structure in which the whole produces music rather than noise. The management of this orchestra is in itself a significant mental undertaking that occupies a portion of every single day of her life. But managing servants also costs money beyond their wages. Good servants expect good conditions. They expect adequate food, which means the household food budget must account not only for the family's meals but for the servants' meals, which are eaten separately but must be sufficient and decent, because a cook who feels she is being fed badly will leave, and a good cook is worth keeping. They expect the use of appropriate facilities, reasonable hours within the extreme inflexibility of Victorian domestic service culture, and occasional small recognitions that they exist as people rather than furniture. Eleanor is good at this. She knows all of their names, their hometown counties, which of the housemaids is saving to marry, which of the kitchen maids is homesick. This knowledge costs her nothing except attention, and it buys her a level of loyalty that no wage increase alone would produce. The household food budget, including both family meals and staff meals, runs to something between £400 and £500 a year. This covers not only the daily food but the more elaborate provisions for dinner parties, which Eleanor hosts on average twice a month during the London season, and perhaps once a month at other times of year. A formal dinner party for 12 guests, which is Eleanor's preferred size for managing conversation well, costs in the neighbourhood of £8 to £12 in food and wine alone, not counting the additional domestic labour required before and after. And the wine. Let us talk about the wine cellar, because Mr. Pemberton is genuinely interested in wine, and the Pemberton cellar is a point of quiet pride, maintained with more attention than most people dedicate to their accounts. An adequate supply of good Bordeaux, Burgundy, champagne for appropriate occasions, decent port for after dinner, sherry for the ladies before, and various everyday clarets for the family table, maintained at an appropriate level and occasionally enhanced by a case or two of something particularly good, runs to perhaps £150 to £200 annually. Some years more. It is an investment, in the sense that a good cellar is one of the things a well-informed dinner guest notices and remembers. Now we have arrived, I think, at one of the most fascinating areas of Eleanor's spending, the one that most reveals what wealthy Victorian life actually felt like from the inside. The money spent on children, specifically on the project of raising children correctly for their social position. Eleanor has 2 children, a son, 12 years old, who we might call Arthur, currently at a good prep school in Surrey with his sights on Eton, a daughter 9 years old, who we can call Cecily, being educated at home with a governess and various additional instructors. The cost of producing these children into the people they are supposed to become is substantial, and is a subject Eleanor thinks about seriously and often. Arthur's school costs £65 a year in fees. There are additional costs on top of this, books and equipment and the correct trunk and the uniform and the various extras that schools of this type always produce quietly throughout the year without much warning. The total annual cost of Arthur's schooling runs closer to £90, and this is the beginning, When Arthur moves on to Eton, which the Pembertons intend, the fees there are higher, and the social costs of Eton, the correct clothing, the equipment, the occasional spending money at the right level, not so much that he becomes careless with it, but enough that he is not conspicuously short, will add more again. Cecily's education at home looks less expensive on the surface, but is not, once you account for its actual components. The governess, a well-trained woman who speaks French competently and plays the piano well enough to teach it, and has been with the household for 3 years, earns £35 annually. She is paid separately from the household servants and eats with the family rather than with the staff, which places her in a social category of her own, slightly ambiguous, quietly uncomfortable, but practically necessary. On top of the governess, Cecily has a piano teacher who comes to the house twice a week, a French conversation teacher who comes once a week to keep the governess's teaching sharp, and a drawing mistress. These 3 between them cost an additional £50 to £60 a year, because a girl of Cecily's position is expected to arrive at adulthood able to play the piano at least acceptably well, to draw at least a little, to speak French at least adequately, and to conduct herself in any social situation with a confidence that looks effortless. These are not accomplishments for their own sake. They are the tools with which Cecily will one day be presented to the world. Let us stay with this for a moment, because I find it one of the most quietly revelatory things about the 1880s social world. The enormous amount of money and time and energy that flowed into preparing girls for the drawing room, the visiting card, the dinner table, not for anything useful in the practical sense, not for a profession, not for independence, for the performance of being someone's wife, specifically someone's wife at a certain level of society. The governess teaches Cecily French so that when Cecily is a married woman she can conduct a brief conversation in French at a dinner party without embarrassment. The piano teacher comes twice a week so that when Cecily is a wife she can sit at the drawing room instrument and play for guests when asked without disgracing herself. These are the aims, and the money spent on achieving them is not thought of as an investment in Cecily exactly. It is thought of as an investment in the family's future social position, which Cecily, through her eventual marriage, will either advance or fail to advance, and the failure of which would be at least partly attributable to inadequate preparation. I do not say this to be harsh about the people who held these views. I say it because I think it is important to sit with what these sums of money were actually purchasing, which was, in many respects, a very elaborate form of invisible labour preparation for women who would never be acknowledged as working. Eleanor herself understands this better than anyone might expect, because she is herself a product of exactly this preparation. She was taught the piano and the French and the drawing. She was given the social education and the observational training and the emotional management skills, all entirely informally, through years of watching and imitating and correcting, and she is now applying all of it in the management of the Pemberton household and social world. She is working every single day with a skill and dedication that would be recognized as professional in almost any other context. But it is not a profession, it is just her life. Here is what I think about when I consider the account book open on Eleanor's writing desk. She is very good at this. She is genuinely expert at the calibration of social spending, at knowing what must be done at full cost and what can be managed more carefully without anyone noticing, at timing large expenditures against the social calendar, at knowing which invitation requires a new dress and which can be satisfied with something already in the wardrobe, remade slightly by Madame Lemaire's seamstress in a single afternoon. She has an eye for the things that create an impression that outweighs their cost. Fresh flowers in the hall instead of an expensive new ornament for the drawing-room mantelpiece. A particularly good wine at a small dinner for important guests, rather than a mediocre wine at a large dinner where no one would notice the difference. This calibration is itself a kind of art form, and it is one that she never receives credit for, publicly, socially, in any formal way. It is simply assumed to happen, the way the fires are assumed to appear in the grates and the silver is assumed to shine. Let us step now into another dimension of Eleanor's spending that tends to surprise people who have not spent much time with the period. her philanthropic and charitable expenditures, because in the 1880s, for a woman of Eleanor's position, charity is not optional. It is not a matter of personal feeling or religious conviction, though it may involve both. It is a social obligation with a currency value, and the management of that obligation is another item in Eleanor's account book. Eleanor sits on the committees of 3 charitable organisations: a society that provides meals to the working poor of Southwark, a fund that supports the widows of soldiers, and a committee associated with a local church that maintains a small school in one of the less prosperous nearby parishes. Her membership in these organisations costs her money directly in the form of subscriptions, and costs her time in the form of committee meetings and organisational correspondence and occasional public appearances at fundraising events. But it costs her something else that is harder to quantify, and perhaps more valuable than either of those, which is the ongoing social performance of appropriate benevolence. A wealthy woman in the 1880s who is not visibly engaged in some form of charitable work is a social problem. She is subject to a vague but persistent suspicion that something is wrong with her, that she is either selfish or idle or strangely private, none of which reflect well on the household she represents. The right charities, approached in the right way, with the right level of visible engagement, serve 2 purposes simultaneously. They are, genuinely, doing some good in the world, which Eleanor cares about, and they are, simultaneously, maintaining a social standing that has real practical value for the Pemberton family. These 2 purposes are not in conflict, they are simply both true at once, the way most things in Eleanor's life are both true at once. Her charitable subscriptions total something in the region of £30 to £40 per year. The additional costs of attending committee events, the appropriate dress for a fundraising luncheon, the carriage required, the small personal donations made on the spot when a particularly compelling case is presented, push that figure closer to 50 or 60. It is not nothing, but it is not the largest item in the account book either, and it is by any useful measure one of the best investments she makes. Now let us talk about something that the account book shows but that Eleanor would never discuss with anyone. The money spent on maintaining appearances when the appearances are harder to maintain than they look, because here is something about the Pemberton finances that the Belgravia exterior does not suggest. Mr. Pemberton's business is profitable, but the 1880s are a period of periodic economic disruption in the steel industry, and there have been 2 years in the recent past when the profits were less than expected. In those years, Eleanor did not cut her clothing budget or reduce the flour order or dismiss a servant. Those would be visible reductions. What she did instead was to manage very carefully in the places no one could see. She delayed replacing the carpets in the second guest bedroom for 2 years beyond the point when they should have been replaced. She reduced the quality of coal slightly in the servants' quarters while maintaining the family's coal unchanged. She postponed a planned renovation of the kitchen, which the cook wanted badly and Eleanor had promised, and managed the postponement with enough grace that the cook did not leave. She negotiated payment terms with Madame le Maire, spreading the cost of 2 gowns across 4 months rather than settling immediately as she usually did. These invisible economies are as much a part of Eleanor's skill as the visible expenditures. Anyone managing a social life at this level while working with finances that have any degree of variability learns this. You protect the things that are seen and you quietly compress the things that are not. The guest bedrooms that no guest uses this season can wait for new carpet. The drawing room carpet, which is seen by everyone who enters the house and on which every first impression of the household rests, is replaced on schedule without hesitation. I find this aspect of Eleanor's management almost more admirable than the spending itself, because anyone with enough money can spend it on the right things. What requires real skill is the maintenance of a complete social front while navigating genuine financial constraint in silence, without letting the constraint show, without letting the anxiety show, without letting anything show that would suggest to the watchful eyes of Belgravia that the Pemberton house is anything other than entirely comfortable. Let us move now into one of the most interesting categories of Victorian wealthy women's spending: the things they bought for themselves, not for the household, not for the social project, not for the children, just for themselves. And the extraordinary amount of subterfuge and reframing that surrounded these purchases in order to make them socially and domestically acceptable. Reading material to begin with. The 1880s are a period of extraordinary literary production, and Eleanor reads voraciously in the way that very intelligent women whose intelligence has nowhere else to go often read, with a thoroughness and an appetite that would strike a modern reader as almost professional. She subscribes to 2 circulating libraries. Moody's is the main one, and the subscription costs around £2 to £3 a year for the standard family membership, which allows the borrowing of several volumes at a time. She also buys books outright, more often than her husband quite realizes, because she handles the household accounts and can describe almost anything to him as a household expense without being questioned. A 3-volume novel from a good publisher costs around £1 and 6 shillings in the early 1880s, though this was declining steadily as the publishing industry changed, and Eleanor buys 3 or 4 per month, which she keeps in her morning room rather than the library to avoid them looking like a quantity. She reads George Eliot with the kind of attention usually reserved for scripture. She read Middlemarch for the first time at 20 years old, and then immediately read it again, which is something she has never told anyone because there is something in that admission that feels more private than almost anything else about her. She reads Trollope and Hardy and the occasional imported French novel, though those she is more careful about, because French novels have a reputation and the reputation is not entirely unearned, and she does not particularly want to be asked questions about what she is reading. She reads the major periodicals, the Fortnightly Review and the 19th Century, which carry the serious political and social essays of the day. She reads these not to form opinions she might voice, but because she genuinely wants to know things, wants to understand the world she lives in at a depth beyond what the morning room and the calling card allow. Music is another area where Eleanor's personal spending lives. She takes no professional lessons now, having been taught to the standard considered sufficient for her social function and not encouraged beyond it. But she has a subscription to a concert series at the Queen's Hall that she attends several times a year, sometimes with her husband and sometimes with a friend. Concert tickets at a good series run to several shillings each, and there are additional costs: the carriage, the appropriate dress for an evening out, occasionally supper afterward. The total annual music expenditure is perhaps £15 to £20, small in the context of the full budget, large in the context of what it gives her. There are hours at the Queen's Hall that Eleanor thinks about afterward for days. A particular performance of a Brahms symphony last season that she cannot quite get out of her head. The pianist of extraordinary gifts who played a Chopin nocturne in the second half of a mixed program and produced from the instrument something so exact and so moving that Eleanor found herself crying quietly in the dark of the concert hall, in a way that had nothing to do with the social world or the account book or the project of managing the Pemberton position, and everything to do with the simple, overwhelming fact of being a human being alive in the world and able to hear something beautiful. She has never told anyone about that evening either. It seems too private to share, too much her own, which brings us to something I want to think about with you for a moment: the emotional economy of Eleanor's spending. Not the pounds and shillings, but the feeling. What it feels like from inside a life like this, to be spending at this scale and with this purpose. There is genuine pleasure in it. Eleanor would be the first to say so, if asked in private, though she would frame it carefully. She genuinely enjoys choosing beautiful things. She genuinely loves the effect of a well-arranged room. She feels something close to satisfaction when a dinner party goes perfectly, when the food is good and the flowers are perfect, and the conversation reaches the kind of liveliness that makes a table feel like a living thing. These pleasures are real, and she does not pretend otherwise to herself. She is not a martyr to her social role. She is in many ways genuinely excellent at it, and genuinely absorbed in it. But there is also a cost that is harder to name, a kind of tiredness that is not physical, not the tiredness of having worked too hard or slept too little, but something deeper, the tiredness of being always on, of inhabiting a public self so completely and so continuously that the private self occasionally feels like a garment she has not worn in so long she is not sure it still fits. The mornings at the concert hall, the hours in the morning room with a book, the rare evenings when the children are in bed and her husband is out and she sits alone by the fire playing the piano just for herself, not for guests, not for any audience, playing through something she finds difficult because she finds it difficult, because the difficulty is the point, because navigating difficulty in private is the only kind of difficulty she is ever purely in charge of. These are the moments that keep Eleanor herself. I want to walk through a typical week in Eleanor's spending life in some detail, because the rhythm of it is as interesting as the sums. Let us say it is late October, which is neither the full London season nor the full country season, but a transitional period with its own particular social obligations. Monday. Eleanor receives the housekeeper's weekly accounts in the morning, as she does every Monday. She reviews them with a trained eye, noting anything that strikes her as out of line, questioning the price of the coal delivery which she suspects the coal merchant has inflated slightly since their usual supplier, and asking Mrs. Barlow, the housekeeper, to look into it. She writes 3 letters, one to the mother of a girl she is considering as a second governess for Cecily's afternoon lessons, one to her dressmaker confirming the time for Friday's fitting, and one to the organising secretary of the Widows' Fund Committee acknowledging the agenda for next week's meeting. She goes out in the afternoon carriage to make 2 calls, neither of which requires a new costume but both of which require the current visiting dress to be freshly pressed and her gloves to be spotless. She spends on this day approximately nothing of note, though the housekeeper's accounts she has approved account for the week's food and household supplies, which will run to roughly £9 or £10. Tuesday. She has an arrangement with 3 other women of her acquaintance, women she genuinely likes, which is not always guaranteed with social arrangements, to walk in the park on Tuesday mornings when the weather allows. This costs nothing except the carriage to the park and back, 2 shillings, and the conversation, which is the kind that Eleanor finds genuinely restorative. These women are all navigating similar lives with similar constraints, and there is an ease between them, a shared knowledge of exactly what the other person's week feels like, that makes the conversation light and the understanding effortless. In the afternoon, Cecily's piano teacher comes. Eleanor pays him at the end of the month, Wednesday. This is Eleanor's at-home day, which means that from 3 until 6 in the afternoon her drawing room is open to callers, and anyone who is part of her social circle knows they may come without appointment. She has prepared for this. The drawing room has been cleaned and arranged. The flowers are fresh. The tea service is out, the one that was a wedding gift and is still the best thing in the house and which Eleanor uses specifically for these afternoons. The cook has prepared small sandwiches, bread and butter, a seed cake and a plate of small sweet biscuits. By modern standards this sounds simple. By the standards of what is required for an at-home of this quality, it is substantial, and the additional food cost is perhaps £2 to £3 on top of the regular household provisions. 6 people come, 4 leave cards without staying, 2 stay for tea and an hour of conversation. Eleanor is a good hostess, which means she makes both of them feel that they are the only interesting people she has seen in weeks, though she has seen 11 people over the past 3 days. Thursday. The account book morning as we described at the beginning, then a fitting appointment, not at Madame Lemaire's but at a separate establishment she uses for her day dresses, a slightly less expensive alternative that produces work of entirely satisfactory quality. She is having a new morning dress made, a deep green wool for winter mornings, which will cost £14 and be ready in 3 weeks. In the afternoon she writes the week's correspondence that has accumulated, 4 thank you notes for various occasions, a letter to her mother in Hampshire, a note to a friend who has been unwell. Friday. She goes to Madame Lemaire's for the fitting she has confirmed on Monday. This is for the evening gown she has commissioned for a dinner at the end of November, a dark silk in a blue so deep it reads almost as black in some lights but catches colour differently at the right angle. The bodice will have jet beading along the neckline. She stands in the fitting room while Madame Lemaire's most senior fitter works around her with pins, and she and the fitter discuss the fall of the skirt and whether the neckline should sit slightly higher. Eleanor has an eye for these things. She knows exactly how the finished garment should look because she has been imagining it since she chose the fabric 4 weeks ago. In the afternoon, she takes Cecily out to the Natural History Museum, which has been open just a few years and which Cecily is fascinated by. Eleanor is also fascinated by it, in a way she did not quite expect the first time she came. The extraordinary Victorian ambition of the building itself and the extraordinary collections within it. She walks through the long galleries with her daughter, and they look at fossils together, and Eleanor answers the questions she can, and admits she does not know when she does not know, which is how she was never taught to behave in public, but which her daughter, she has decided, should learn to regard as perfectly acceptable. Saturday. The children are both at home. Arthur returned from school for the weekend. The household has a different energy on Saturdays, less managed, more genuine. Mr. Pemberton comes home from his club at lunchtime, and the 4 of them eat together in a way they do not manage on weekdays. Eleanor spends the afternoon writing in her private journal, which she has kept since she was 16, and which no one, including her husband, has ever read. She writes about the week, about a conversation at home that has stayed with her, about the look on Cecily's face when they stood in front of the great blue whale skeleton at the museum, about a passage in the Trollope novel she is currently reading that made her put the book down and look at the wall for a while. Sunday. Church in the morning, a social obligation that requires appropriate dress for the appropriate occasion in the appropriate pew. Luncheon with a neighbouring family afterward, a standing arrangement that rotates between households. Eleanor has her cook prepare a leg of lamb for 12 people, which will cost perhaps £1.10 in meat alone, plus the additional vegetables and the pudding, and which will be carried to the table and served with enough ease that no guest will think about the labour required to produce it. In the evening the children go back up to the nursery and the Pembertons sit alone together in the drawing room, which is Eleanor's favourite hour of the week. Her husband reads, she plays the piano. Later they talk, more honestly than they ever talk in company, and she tells him about the week in a version that is edited for his interest, leaving out the tedium and the social calibration and the Wednesday at home anxiety, emphasizing the things that will make him feel that the household is running well and that the social world is cooperating with their ambitions, which it largely is. This is a week. It adds up to something between £40 and £50 in active expenditure, though that figure fluctuates. Some weeks bring larger bills, a dressmaker's account settled, a carriage repair, an unexpected social occasion requiring additional flowers or additional food, or an unexpected gift of some kind. Some weeks are quieter and cheaper, but the average held over the year sustains the larger total that the account book tells. Let us go deeper into something I have mentioned only briefly so far. The money Eleanor spends on her body itself, not just the clothing that covers it, but the treatments, preparations and practices she uses to maintain the physical presentation that her social role requires. Skincare in the 1880s is not what modern skincare is. The industry is in its early stages. The understanding of how skin works is limited and often wrong, and the range of available products is a peculiar mixture of genuinely effective preparations and things that would make a modern dermatologist wince. But the intention behind the expenditure is entirely recognizable. Eleanor is trying to look well, specifically to look the kind of well that communicates youth, health, good breeding, and appropriate attention to her appearance. She uses cold cream, which has been the basic English cleansing preparation for women of her class for several generations. Cold cream is made from a combination of beeswax, mineral oil or lard, rose water, and a small amount of borax, and it works well enough as a cleanser and a basic moisturizer. She buys it from a pharmacist in Piccadilly in small pots that cost 2 or 3 shillings each and last a few weeks. She uses it at night, applying it over her face and removing it with a soft cloth before bed, having been told and having read and having observed through years that women who clean their skin carefully age better than women who do not. And she has concluded this is probably true. She also uses a glycerin and rosewater preparation on her face in the mornings, a few drops applied carefully after washing, which she has found through years of trial keeps her skin from the dryness that London winters, with their coal fires and cold wind, would otherwise produce. She uses a small amount of face powder, the kind made from precipitated chalk and orris root and perhaps a little zinc, applied so lightly as to be invisible in normal light and detectable only in the harshest gas lamp, because no respectable woman of Eleanor's class wears visible cosmetics, which means that visible cosmetics are the thing that is always being carefully concealed, rather than the thing that is not being worn. This distinction is important and slightly absurd and entirely consistent with how the 1880s social world navigates the gap between its stated values and its actual practices. Cosmetics, in the technical sense of things applied to alter the appearance, are used by women of the working class and actresses, neither category of which is respectable. Respectable women do not use cosmetics. They use preparations which serve similar functions and which are not called cosmetics and are not acknowledged and are therefore entirely fine. Eleanor's lady's maid, whose name is Mary, has been with her for 6 years and is the only person other than Eleanor herself who knows the full detail of Eleanor's beauty routine. Mary knows which preparations work and which do not. She knows the particular combination of glycerin and a little milk that Eleanor uses on her hands before sleeping, kept in a small covered dish by the bedside, because Eleanor's hands are her most publicly visible feature after her face, and she takes their maintenance seriously. She knows how much rice powder is enough, and how much is too much. She knows how Eleanor's hair behaves in different weather conditions, and what the hair needs on a damp day versus a dry day, versus the days before a big evening when the style must hold through 5 hours of warmth and movement. Mary's knowledge is intimate and particular and entirely unacknowledged by anyone outside the walls of Eleanor's dressing room. It is worth pointing out that this knowledge, carefully accumulated over years of close observation and daily practice, represents a genuine expertise. Mary knows more about maintaining the appearance of a wealthy Victorian woman than any published beauty writer of the period, because she is doing it in practice every day rather than theorizing about it in a column. This expertise earns her £32 a year and 2 afternoons off per month. The dressing room itself is worth describing, because the room and its contents tell their own story about what Victorian beauty maintenance actually looked like. There is a long dressing table with a mirror, triple-panelled, angled slightly so that Eleanor can see herself from 3 directions simultaneously. On the table, arranged in the order that Mary has established over years of practice, the cold cream in its glass pot, the glycerin preparation, the rice powder in a round box of tortoiseshell with a puff, the hairpins in a small china dish, the pair of crimping irons that live in a leather roll when not in use, the boar bristle brush and the long-handled comb, the small bottle of lavender water that Eleanor uses on her handkerchiefs, the scent bottle from the Burlington Arcade perfumer, the small enamelled box that holds her headache powders, and in a drawer below, the collection of hairpieces, pads, and supplementary switches of hair in Eleanor's own colour that Mary uses to create the volume and elaboration that 1880s hairstyling requires, because this is something modern people tend not to know. Victorian hairstyles, those elaborate, lifted, scrolled, pinned arrangements that look so effortless in the portraits, are not made from the woman's own hair alone. They cannot be. There is not enough hair on any single human head to produce the volume those styles require, particularly as the fashion of the period pushes toward more and more elaborate edifices of pinned and coiled and waved hair, supplemented by what were called switches and pads and rats, cushioned wire frames over which the real hair was draped and pinned into place. Mary's arrangement of Eleanor's hair on a morning before an important social occasion takes between 45 minutes and an hour. On a regular morning it takes around 25 to 30 minutes. The total time Mary devotes to Eleanor's hair over the course of a year is somewhere in the region of 150 to 180 hours. Eleanor receives this as a matter of course, sits still for it, sometimes reads during the process or goes over the day's plans in her mind, and then stands and moves into her day with the product of those hours arranged on her head, not thinking about it again unless something comes loose, at which point the anxiety is immediate and acute. We should talk about corsets, because no account of what a Victorian wealthy woman's body cost to maintain is complete without talking about corsets, and because the reality of them is both more complicated and more humanly interesting than the straightforward story of oppression that they tend to get reduced to. Eleanor wears a corset. She has worn one every day since she was 16, when she graduated from the lighter stays of her childhood to a proper boned corset of the adult style. She cannot imagine the day without one, in the way that a person cannot imagine the day without the particular shoes they have worn for years, not because the shoes are comfortable exactly, but because they have become so habitual that the body has organized itself around their presence. Eleanor's corset is not a torture device, though certain corsets of the period, particularly the very tightly laced ones fashionable in some circles and advocated in certain women's magazines, can become so. Eleanor's is made to measure by a corsetier whose workroom is off Bond Street, from a combination of coutil, a strong woven fabric with a slight diagonal weave that gives it structural memory, and whalebone, which is actually baleen, the keratin strips that filter feeders of the whale family use to sieve food from water, and which happens to be an extraordinary structural material, firm enough to hold a shape, but with just enough flex to breathe with the wearer. Eleanor's corset is not what the tightest lacing enthusiasts would call tight. It reduces her natural waist measurement by perhaps 2 inches, which is at the less extreme end of what the period considers normal. It creates the silhouette her clothes are designed to fit, which means that if she wore the same clothes without the corset, they would not hang correctly. The shaping built into the dress pattern assumes the shape the corset creates. The two are inseparable and designed in reference to each other. The corsetier who makes Eleanor's corsets has been making them to the same measurements for 4 years, with minor adjustments as Eleanor's body has changed slightly, as all bodies do over time. A new corset, made to measure, costs between £2 and £4 depending on the materials and the elaborateness of the construction. Eleanor has 2 in regular rotation and replaces them when the boning begins to shift or the coutil shows stress. This happens every year or two. There is a ritual to the putting on and the taking off that structures Eleanor's day at both ends. Mary laces her in the morning, tightening the long lace through the eyelets at the back until the corset sits correctly, neither too tight nor too loose, checked by a practiced eye and a practiced hand. At the end of the day, Mary unlaces her, and there is a relief to that unlacing that Eleanor feels in her whole body, a release and an exhale that is one of the day's small physical pleasures. The body briefly is entirely its own again. Then the nightgown, the hair braided for sleeping, the cold cream applied, and the particular quality of rest that comes when the day's armour has been entirely removed. Let us step back from the physical details for a moment and think about the wider world of Victorian commerce that Eleanor's spending was embedded in, because the 1880s are a fascinating and transitional period in the history of how wealthy people shop and what shopping means. The department store is still relatively new in London in 1883. Whiteley's in Queensway has been trading in its current large-scale form since the 1870s, describing itself, somewhat grandly, as a universal provider. The great drapers like Swan and Edgar and Marshall and Snellgrove are evolving into something larger, something that combines retail goods with theatrical shopping experience in a way that is entirely new. Harrods, which began as a single grocer's shop in Knightsbridge in the 1840s, has by the 1880s grown into a substantial retail establishment, with departments for a wide range of goods, though its full transformation into the Harrods of legend is still a decade or so away. Eleanor shops in all of these places, but she also shops in the older, smaller, more particular establishments that have served wealthy London households for generations. The wine merchant in St James's Street, where the Pembertons have an account, the linen draper in a quiet street near Bond Street that has been selling fine cotton and linen since before Eleanor was born, and where the staff know the family's preferences without having to be reminded. The grocer in Fortnum and Mason who sources the particular Indian tea that Mr. Pemberton has preferred since his business brought him into contact with the tea trade. This is a world of accounts rather than cash. Eleanor does not, in the normal course of her shopping, exchange money at the point of purchase in most of the establishments she uses regularly. She charges to the account which is maintained by the merchant and settled quarterly by Mr. Pemberton or by Eleanor herself from the household funds. This system of credit is not what we would now call credit in the sense of borrowing. It is more a practical convenience, an ongoing relationship of trust between a household and its suppliers that removes the awkwardness of immediate cash exchange from transactions conducted between people who know each other well. But the account system also means that it is possible, in a way that pure cash purchasing would make more visible, to spend more than is currently comfortable and to defer the reckoning to another quarter. Eleanor knows this. She is careful with it. She has seen households of her acquaintance run into difficulties by letting their accounts with tradespeople grow too large. By using the account system as a genuine form of extended credit rather than merely a quarterly payment arrangement. She does not do this, but she is aware of the temptation, and the awareness is part of what keeps her Thursday mornings at the account book regular and methodical rather than occasional and anxious. The shopping itself is an experience worth describing, because the act of shopping in 1880s London for a woman of Eleanor's position is as much a social experience as a commercial one. When Eleanor visits her dressmaker, it is not a quick errand. It is an appointment of at least an hour, often longer, involving tea served by an assistant, discussion of fabric and cut and trimming in considerable detail, reference to French fashion plates in Le Moniteur de la Mode or La Mode Illustrée, because French fashion is the reference point from which all English fashion of the period positions itself, even when the final product is entirely English. The dressmaker knows Eleanor's tastes, knows her colouring, knows which styles suit her figure and which do not. The conversation is partly commercial and partly social, conducted with a particular formality that acknowledges the commercial nature of the relationship, while maintaining the social fiction that this is a meeting of connoisseurs rather than a transaction between a buyer and a seller. Similarly at the bootmaker, the glove maker, the milliner, whose workroom she visits twice a year for new hats, a process that involves sitting in a chair before a large mirror while the milliner's assistants bring out frames and trimmings and try different combinations in front of her eyes. The mirrors angled to show the effect from multiple directions, the milliner herself offering observations about what works and what does not, with the confidence of long professional experience. A good hat from a good milliner cost between £2 and £5 in the 1880s. Eleanor has perhaps 12 to 15 hats in regular circulation, and she replaces 3 or 4 per year. And then there is the social shopping. The gifts, which are a category of their own in the Victorian social economy. Wedding gifts, christening gifts, Christmas gifts for the children, New Year gifts, which were more of a custom in Eleanor's parents' generation, but which she still observes for certain close relationships. Birthday gifts for the children of friends, gifts for servants, which are a traditional obligation at Christmas, and which occupy Eleanor's attention for a week or two in December every year, as she considers what each member of the household would most appreciate, because a gift that shows you have actually thought about the person is worth several times as much goodwill as a gift that shows you have simply spent money without thought. The gifts for servants are not extravagant. An extra week's wages is common at Christmas. A small personal gift, something useful, a warm scarf for the housemaid who is always cold, a particular tin of something the cook mentioned once as a favourite, something that shows attention more than wealth. These small amounts add up, across 12 servants and the coachman and stable boy, to perhaps £15 to £20 at Christmas, which is both genuinely significant for the recipients and an investment in the household's goodwill that pays out every day of the rest of the year. Let us think about something that Eleanor's account book does not directly record, but that costs her money in an indirect and continuous way. The cost of maintaining the social intelligence that makes all of the other spending possible and effective. Eleanor reads, we have already discussed this. She reads newspapers and periodicals and novels, partly for the pleasure of it, and partly because someone who does not read is not current, does not have the references, does not understand the conversations that are happening in the social world she operates in. She reads the Times, which is delivered to the household every morning, and which she goes through after Mr. Pemberton has finished with it, reading the society columns as well as the political news, The public announcements of births, marriages, deaths, the court circular, the advertisements. The court circular tells her who is in London and who has gone to the country and who has returned. The society columns tell her who has been seen with whom and at which events. These are not gossip in the trivial sense. They are intelligence, the kind of current social intelligence without which effective social management is impossible. She also calls on people. The morning call, that extraordinary Victorian institution, which was not conducted in the morning at all but in the early to mid-afternoon, roughly between 2 and 5 o'clock, was the primary mechanism by which social intelligence was gathered and maintained. When Eleanor calls on a friend and is received, and they sit together for 20 minutes or half an hour in the drawing room, the conversation is not usually intimate, not in the sense of being deeply personal. It is social, in the specific sense that it covers the social world they share, who is doing what, who has been invited where, who is travelling, who is unwell, who has had good fortune recently, whose daughter is being courted by whom, who is having difficulties of one kind or another that the social world has begun to notice. This is not unkind, not mostly. It is information exchange. It is the news service of a world that has no other mechanism for current social news. The newspapers carry public events and society announcements, but the texture of the social world, what is actually happening between people, is carried in these short, formal, perfectly mannered afternoon visits, and Eleanor is very good at them. She is good at asking the right question, and good at giving the response that opens the other person's information without committing too much of her own. She is good at the particular formulation that sounds like she is sharing while she is actually gathering. This skill, built over a lifetime of practice, is applied every time she sits in someone else's drawing room with a teacup in her gloved hand. Now let us settle deeper into the evening, because the evening is where the money really shows, and where the pressure is highest, and where Eleanor's skill is most fully tested. A dinner party at the Pemberton House is a production with a budget and a staging that would not embarrass a small theatrical company. The dinner Eleanor is planning for the following week, a Thursday dinner for 14 guests, represents the largest single expenditure of any given month, and requires planning that begins a full 10 days before the event. The guest list is not random. The construction of a dinner party guest list is in Eleanor's practice one of the most precise social calculations she makes. 14 people must be balanced in terms of social level, which means no one present should feel they are dining considerably above or considerably below their station. They must be balanced in terms of interest, because a dinner party in which everyone works in the same field, or holds the same opinions, or knows all the same people, becomes a dull dinner party, and a dull dinner party is one that people remember without affection and do not repay. They must be balanced in terms of gender, 8 men and 6 women being the number Eleanor has arrived at for this particular 14, because the table conversation works better when the ratio is slightly in favour of men, whose conversational confidence in mixed company tends to run higher in this period, though Eleanor has met enough brilliant and articulate women who more than hold their own, that she considers this a tendency rather than a rule, and they must be balanced against each other as specific personalities, which means Eleanor carries in her mind a detailed social map of who is easy with whom, who has had a difficulty in the recent past that makes them sitting near each other awkward, who is interesting to whom, who should be seated where to manage the conversation most effectively. The table for 14 is Eleanor's drawing room table pulled out to its full extension with the centre leaf inserted, which seats 14 without crowding, covered with the best linen tablecloth, which is Irish damask laundered and pressed to a standard where you could read a newspaper through it if you chose to. The crease of each fold a perfect straight line running exactly down the centre. The silver service, the Pemberton silver that Mr. Pemberton bought at auction 6 years ago, and which Eleanor has quietly thought of as hers ever since, laid precisely by Ellis the parlour maid under Eleanor's supervision the morning of the dinner, because the silver takes a full 2 hours to lay out and arrange, and Eleanor will not have it done at the last moment, when everything else is also demanding attention. The flowers for the dinner table are different from the everyday house flowers. They are lower because tall floral arrangements block conversation between the people seated across from each other and therefore defeat one of the dinner table's primary functions. They are more carefully composed in terms of colour, chosen to work with the colour of the linen and the glint of the silver in candlelight, because the dinner table is seen in candlelight, and what is beautiful in daylight is not always what is beautiful in candlelight, and Eleanor knows the difference. The flowers for this particular dinner will cost around £1.10 from her regular florist, ordered 2 days before so they arrive fresh on the morning. The menu. This is a conversation Eleanor has with Mrs. Partridge, her cook, every Tuesday morning in the week before a dinner, in the kitchen over a cup of tea with the recipe books open. Mrs. Partridge is a woman of considerable culinary skill who worked in 2 larger households before coming to the Pembertons, and who has a particular talent for the kind of elegant but not excessively complicated cooking that a dinner party of this type requires. Too simple, and the guests feel the host has not tried. Too complicated, and the kitchen is overstretched, and the timing becomes precarious, and something will not quite be right, and Eleanor will know, and Eleanor will mind. The menu for a formal dinner of this period follows a structure. First course, soup, always. The thing that settles the table and warms people who have come in from the November cold in their best clothes and are still finding their social footing. Then fish. Then a remove, which is the grand main dish. Perhaps a joint of beef, perhaps a roast leg of mutton, perhaps a pheasant in the shooting season, which it is in late October. Then entrees, 2 small secondary dishes that complement the remove, then vegetables separately served. Then a sweet, and perhaps a savoury at the end if the dinner is running long and people are still settled and happy. Then dessert, which is fresh and dried fruit, nuts, the things you eat with your fingers while the conversation grows more relaxed and the wine has done its work. For 14 people, this amounts to something between £10 and £14 in food costs, depending on what is in season and what the meat market is offering. Mrs. Partridge manages this budget with skill. She knows where to spend the money where it shows, the quality of the beef, the freshness of the fish, which must be purchased the morning of and which Eleanor pays for from petty cash directly rather than via account, because the fish merchant's account becomes complicated. And she knows where to be more careful, the vegetables and the store cupboard components that can be purchased ahead at better prices. The wine for 14 people over a 4-course dinner with dessert amounts to between 8 and 12 bottles, depending on how freely it flows, and it will flow relatively freely because Mr. Pemberton knows his wine and likes his guests to know that he knows it. A good Bordeaux for the meat course, a decent Burgundy for the fish if there is one, champagne if Eleanor decides to serve it, which she does not always because she finds it changes the tone of the dinner in ways she does not always prefer, but which she will serve on this occasion because one of the guests is someone she very much wants to impress with the fullness of the Pemberton hospitality. The total cost of this dinner, including food, wine, additional flowers, the candles burned through the evening, the extra coal for the fires in the drawing room and the dining room, the extra wages paid to the kitchen maid for the additional work of the preparation and the clearing, comes to between £25 and £30 for a single evening. Against Eleanor's weekly budget of £40 to £50, this is a very substantial single expenditure, against the value it generates in terms of social relationships reinforced, impressions made, connections cemented, obligations discharged, and goodwill created for the Pemberton household. Eleanor considers it entirely reasonable, and she would be right. Let us drift now into the quieter parts of the account book, the things that appear as small entries, shillings rather than pounds, the routine and the everyday, because these small amounts tell their own story about the texture of wealthy Victorian life, and some of them are among the most interesting details of the whole. Subscriptions. Eleanor belongs to several subscription societies that together give her access to the cultural and intellectual life of London in ways that her domestic role would not otherwise easily provide. Beyond the circulating libraries already mentioned, she subscribes to the Grosvenor Gallery, which opened in 1877 and which has become the fashionable place to see art that is doing something more interesting than the Royal Academy's mainstream. The subscription is 5 shillings and gives her private views of exhibitions before they open to the general public. She values this not only for the art itself, but for the particular kind of social gathering that private views provide, a kind of freedom in which people of intelligence actually talk about things, even in an age and class that generally prefers social conversation over genuine exchange. She subscribes to a flower arranging society, which sounds frivolous and is not, because the society holds monthly demonstrations by the most skilled arrangers in London, and Eleanor has learnt specific techniques here that she applies directly to the arrangement of her house and table flowers. The subscription costs 20 shillings annually and has paid for itself many times over in what she has learned. She has a subscription to a quarterly journal on household management and domestic economy, which is exactly as useful as it sounds and which she reads from cover to cover, marking pages with slips of paper. Some of the articles are obvious, some are genuinely interesting. Occasionally there is an article that makes her rethink something she has been doing for years, and she makes the change quietly, without announcing it to anyone, and notes the result over the following months. Postage. Victorian postage is cheap by any standard. The penny post, established by Rowland Hill in 1840, means that a letter sent anywhere within the United Kingdom costs 1 penny. Eleanor sends a great many letters. She writes 7 to 12 letters in an average week and receives roughly the same number. Her annual postage expenditure is perhaps £2 to £3, which buys an enormous amount of social management. The thank you note that must go within 48 hours of receiving a gift or attending a dinner. The letter of condolence that must be sent within a day of learning of a death in the family of an acquaintance. The careful note to the hostess after a dinner that was particularly enjoyable. The letter to a friend who is unwell and who must be visited but whom Eleanor cannot visit this week because the schedule is already full. These letters are the secondary mechanism of social maintenance, the thread that runs between the visits, and Eleanor's handwriting is confident and clear, and she has been told more than once that her letters are a pleasure to receive, which is both a compliment she genuinely values and a useful social tool in its own right. Carriages and transport. Eleanor's household keeps a carriage, a brougham, which is a small enclosed four-wheeled vehicle pulled by a single horse, appropriate for town use and for making calls. The coachman maintains it and drives it when needed. The annual cost of the horse, the coachman's wages, the stabling, the carriage's maintenance, and the periodic need for new horses when the current one ages out of service or becomes ill, runs to something between £120 and £150 per year. This is a substantial fixed cost but an unavoidable one for a household at Eleanor's level. A woman who calls in a hired cab rather than her own carriage is making a statement about her household's resources that Eleanor has no intention of making. For occasions when her own carriage is occupied, or when she is travelling to a part of London where her coachman does not know the way well, she sometimes uses hired cabs, the two-wheeled hansom being fast and relatively affordable, and the four-wheeled growler being slower but more dignified for longer distances. Cab fares are modest, a shilling or two for most London journeys, and Eleanor carries a small purse of coin for exactly this purpose. Now let us think about something that the account book does not capture at all, something invisible in the financial record but absolutely central to Eleanor's spending world, the emotional labour of managing all of this, the invisible cost that has no line in the ledger. Every pound that Eleanor spends, every social decision she makes, every dinner party she plans, every morning call she returns, exists within a framework of continuous social anxiety that has no respite and no end. This is not neurosis. It is entirely appropriate and rational anxiety in a world where the social consequences of visible failure are real and lasting. A household that slips from one social tier to the one below it does not easily climb back. The connections made at a certain level of society are connections that take years to build and months to lose. A dinner party that goes badly wrong is remembered by 14 people and their spouses and mentioned in letters and morning calls for weeks afterward, drifting outward in circles from the original occasion in ways that are impossible to trace or control. Eleanor carries this awareness with her every day, like a quiet background noise that she has learned to manage but never quite stops hearing. It colours the way she reads her social correspondence, It is present in the deliberation she gives to every expenditure of any consequence, weighing the social return against the financial cost in the quick calculation that years of practice have made nearly automatic. It is present when she sits with her account book on Thursday mornings and reviews the week just past, checking not only the numbers but the social map behind them, asking whether each expenditure has done what it was supposed to do, whether the dinner was the right kind of success, whether the visit to the right people at the right moment has produced the beginning of the warmth she was hoping for. No one acknowledges this calculation. Mr. Pemberton benefits from it daily and appreciates Eleanor's skill in a general and genuine way, but he cannot quite see the detail of it. He is not social in the strategic sense. He is comfortable in social situations and can conduct himself well enough, but the management is not something he does or could do. The skill lives in Eleanor. I want to spend a little time with a particular type of spending that reveals something unexpected about wealthy Victorian women's inner lives. The money spent, quietly and without much acknowledgement, on things that fed not the social project but the self. We have touched on this already, the books, the concerts, the private journal. But there is something more specific worth exploring: the money that some wealthy Victorian women spent, increasingly through the 1880s, on education and self-improvement in a formal sense, not for the social polish that a girl was given as preparation for marriage, for genuine intellectual engagement that the drawing room had no use for, and might, if visible, be considered slightly eccentric. By 1883, the two women's colleges at Cambridge, Girton and Newnham, have been in existence for more than a decade. Women cannot officially take Cambridge degrees, but they can attend lectures, sit examinations, and in some subjects demonstrate an ability that equals or exceeds the male students sitting alongside them. The women who go to Girton or Newnham are not women like Eleanor, women already married and managing households. They are younger women whose families are willing to provide this slightly unusual education. But the existence of these colleges has changed something in the cultural atmosphere that Eleanor breathes every day. It has made it slightly more acceptable for a married woman of intelligent habit to pursue her intellectual interests with something that looks, if you squint at it, like deliberate study. Eleanor takes this permission cautiously and quietly. She has, in the last 2 years, begun attending a series of public lectures on natural history and geology at the Royal Institution, held on Friday afternoons in a format that is explicitly open to women. She goes without telling most of her social circle, because the social circle is divided on this, some finding it admirable and forward-thinking, and some finding it peculiar and slightly suspicious, and she does not want her attendance at lectures to become a topic of conversation in any drawing room before she is sure she can handle whatever is said about it. The lectures cost a small fee, half a crown or 3 shillings each, and Eleanor pays from her personal allowance, which is the discretionary sum she is given monthly for her personal expenditures, things she buys for herself that are not household expenses. The amount she is given is £5 monthly, which is reasonable but not lavish, and which she manages carefully because it must cover not only the personal spending she allows herself, but also the occasional small expenditure she does not want to explain: the extra book, the lecture, the donation she makes to a cause she has not mentioned to Mr. Pemberton because she is not sure he would see the point. This small space of personal financial discretion, £5 a month, is the size of Eleanor's private world in financial terms. Everything else she manages as household expenditure, which is genuinely her domain and which she handles with real authority. But the £5 is hers. It is not very much. It is not nothing. Think about what that means. A woman of Eleanor's intelligence and capability, managing a household budget of several £1,000s a year with genuine professional skill, has personal discretionary income of £60 annually. The governess who teaches her daughter earns £35 a year. Eleanor has access to something less than twice that, personally, for herself, for the things that are only hers. This is not resentment I am suggesting Eleanor feels. It is more subtle than that. It is simply the arithmetic of the position, which tells you something true about what the position actually is. Let us come now to something that Victorian wealthy women spent money on that surprises people when they encounter it. The medical and pharmaceutical spending that runs through the account books of the period is both fascinating and, by any modern standard, alarming. In 1883, the medical profession is a world of genuine uncertainty and actively harmful treatments existing alongside genuine advances, and the wealthy Victorian woman is a target patient for a particular kind of medical attention. She is presumed to be fragile, nervous, prone to what the period calls hysteria or neurasthenia, conditions that cover an enormous range of symptoms from genuine clinical depression to simple boredom to the consequences of wearing a tight corset to social anxiety of the kind that Eleanor manages daily. She is presumed to be particularly susceptible to ailments that require the attention of a male physician and the prescription of treatments that are, with some exceptions, entirely useless. Eleanor is not particularly unwell. She is, by the standards of her age and social position, in reasonably good health. She suffers from headaches, which she manages with powders purchased from the pharmacist that contain a combination of phenacetin and caffeine, and perhaps a small amount of something else, the exact composition not clearly stated on the packaging, which is entirely normal for the period. She has what she calls her nervous days, days when everything feels more effortful than usual, and the surface of the world seems less solid, and these she manages with rest and quiet, and the kind of deliberate calming that she has learnt works for her: a long bath, an afternoon with a book, the piano in the evening if possible. She sees her physician, a man named Dr. Forsyth, roughly 4 times a year in the normal course of things, plus whatever additional visits arise from illness in the household. His fee for a house call is half a guinea. His fee for an office consultation is 5 shillings. He is a man of moderate competence who genuinely believes in the treatments he prescribes, and who would be, by the medical standards of his era, considered perfectly acceptable. His prescriptions for Eleanor's headaches and her nervous days include the phenacetin powders, a tonic containing iron and quinine that she is supposed to take in the mornings, and occasional prescriptions for chloral hydrate to be taken on nights when she cannot sleep, which Eleanor takes only on the worst nights, and with a private wariness about relying on it too regularly. The annual pharmaceutical bill runs to perhaps £8 to £12. The physician's fees over a year that includes a bout of bronchitis in January, Arthur's chest complaint in February, Cecily's chicken pox in the spring, and the usual collection of seasonal ailments, come to approximately £15 to £20. This is money spent on health in a system that, by modern standards, is still largely guessing, but it is money that Eleanor considers an obvious and unquestionable obligation, both because the children's health is something she will spend anything to protect, and because her own health is the machine on which the entire household runs and cannot be allowed to break down. There is one more dimension of Victorian wealthy women's spending that I want to spend time with before we begin our slow drift toward the end of the evening. It is perhaps the least visible and the most interesting of all. The spending that was not in the account book because it was not monetary at all, but which had a value that the purely financial record cannot capture. What Eleanor spends in time, in attention, in the particular quality of presence that she brings to everything she does. When she is planning a dinner party, she is not simply ordering food and flowers. She is thinking about the specific person who will sit at the far left of the table and who has recently had a difficult professional experience and who needs to be placed next to someone who will draw him out rather than remind him of the difficulty. She is thinking about the woman who has been unwell and who Eleanor has been careful to invite at a moment when she seems better, because being included when you are well again after illness matters more than people acknowledge. She is thinking about the pair of people she is seating next to each other who have not met before, but who share a serious interest in a particular subject, and who Eleanor has a strong instinct will find each other genuinely interesting, which, if she is right, will produce one of those dinner table moments that a well-run dinner party can produce, when 2 people lean toward each other and the conversation between them becomes the most alive thing in the room. These moments are the product of Eleanor's investment of attention and knowledge and care across months and years of social observation. They cost nothing that appears in an account book. They require a quality of engagement with other people, a genuine interest in who they are and what they care about and what they need, that is, in its own way, a form of work as skilled and as demanding as anything else she does. I think, sometimes, about how this is understood by the Victorian social world that Eleanor lives inside. The answer is that it is not understood, not explicitly, not systematically. It is simply the baseline expectation. The good hostess produces these moments. How she produces them is not the question anyone asks. What she produces is all anyone sees. Let us move into the slower hours now. The room is quieter, the evening has deepened, and we can afford to let the pace become more like the pace of the firelight. It is a November evening in Belgravia, 1883. The dinner party has ended. The last carriage has pulled away from the door. Eleanor stands in the drawing room for a few minutes after the guests are gone, the way she always does, looking at the room as it is left. The glasses slightly displaced from where they should be, a small indentation in a cushion, the particular way candlelight looks on things that have just been used and are now stilled. She is taking stock. The dinner went well. Not perfectly, which is never quite possible, but well. The conversation at the table had the quality she had been hoping for, a warmth and a liveliness that rose without any managing from Eleanor once the meal began and the wine was open, and people relaxed into themselves. She goes upstairs. Mary helps her undress in the soft light of the bedroom, unlaces the corset, takes down the elaborate evening hairstyle pin by pin with the practiced patience of someone who has done this 1,000 times. Eleanor sits at the dressing table and removes the jet necklace that went so well with the dark silk gown and places it in its velvet case. She applies the cold cream. She washes her face. The woman in the mirror, without the hair and without the ornaments and without the corset silhouette, is softer, quieter, more like herself. Mary withdraws. The house is silent. Eleanor puts on her nightgown, which is fine white cotton with a border of embroidery at the collar and cuffs, laundered to the particular softness that only repeated careful washing produces. She braids her hair the way she has every night for years, her hands moving through the familiar motion without thought. She puts out the lamp. The room is very dark. Outside, the street is quiet at this hour, only the occasional sound of a late carriage or a distant clock. The fire has burned to coals that glow amber behind the grate. Eleanor lies in the dark and thinks about the dinner, the way she always thinks about a dinner in these first minutes before sleep comes, going over the details with a professional eye, not anxiously, with the calm assessment of someone checking their own work. She thinks about the man on her left who had not smiled much at the beginning of the evening but who had relaxed considerably by the end, who had told her something true about his current work that suggested the professional difficulty was beginning to resolve. She thinks about the two people she had placed next to each other who did find each other interesting, who she had observed in conversation twice during the meal, and who had, by the dessert course, exchanged the particular look of two people who intend to continue a conversation that the table has interrupted. Good, she thinks, good. She thinks about the gown, which was right, the dark silk exactly what the occasion called for, the jet beading catching the candlelight in the way she had imagined when she chose it 4 weeks ago standing in Madame Lemaire's fitting room. She thinks about the flowers on the table, which were perhaps slightly too formal, which she will adjust for the next dinner in the direction of something slightly less arranged, slightly more natural, because the fashion is moving that way and Eleanor moves with the fashion a half step ahead of where she currently stands. Then she stops thinking about the dinner. Her mind, released from the evening's management, drifts briefly to the concert she attended last week, the Brahms Symphony, the second movement of which has been in the back of her mind ever since and which she can hear now, in the way music sometimes plays in your mind late at night, with a clarity that the actual performance did not quite have, because in the performance you were also aware of the room and the people and the social context, and now there is none of that, just the music. She thinks about Cecily's face at the museum, the look of complete absorption standing in front of the skeleton of the whale, enormous above them. She had asked Eleanor how they got the skeleton clean when the whale was so big, and Eleanor had not known, had said so, and Cecily had then proposed 3 different theories in succession, each more elaborate than the last. and Eleanor had listened to each one with genuine attention and said that she thought the third theory was probably closest, though she was really only guessing. She thinks about the passage in the Trollope novel she is reading, a sentence about a woman standing in a room full of people who do not quite see her, which made Eleanor put the book down and look at the ceiling for a moment and then pick it up again. She thinks about the account book, the numbers balance more or less. The quarters have been expensive, but not excessively so. The social results of the spending are, by Eleanor's assessment, as strong as they have been in the 3 years since they came to this house in Belgravia. The project is working. The Pemberton position, built on Mr. Pemberton's money and Eleanor's knowledge and Eleanor's skill and Eleanor's daily, hourly, minute-by-minute invisible labour, is solid and becoming more solid. This is something. It is on its own terms a genuinely good thing she has built. She knows that. She also knows in the quiet dark of this particular room at this particular hour that knowing it is not always enough, that there are passages in the Trollope novel she does not quite finish reading before putting the book down, that there is a woman in the mirror some mornings who is more complicated than the account book shows. She does not pursue this thought to any conclusion. She never does. The morning comes early, and Mary will be there with the warm water at 7. The coals have gone from amber to a dull red in the grate. Outside the windows the November rain has started, very quietly, the particular soft rain that London produces in the small hours, the kind that will still be falling in the morning when the street cleaners begin their rounds and the first carts move through the wet streets. Inside, the house is entirely still. In the servants' quarters and the nursery and the rooms between, 12 other people are sleeping, the silver in its case, the flowers in their vases, the account book closed and set straight on the desk, the diary entry written and the diary locked and the key kept where only Eleanor knows it is. £40 a week. More in the months with dinners, with fittings, with the inevitable accumulations of a social world that never quite stops generating its obligations, all of it recorded, managed, calibrated, directed toward a specific and serious purpose. All of it representing a form of professional skill and professional dedication that the period she lives in does not have the vocabulary to acknowledge. The rain falls on Belgravia. The night is deep. Eleanor sleeps. Let us think, before we drift all the way out of this evening, about what Eleanor's spending tells us about the world she inhabited, and about the distance between that world and any world we might recognize as our own. The 1880s were a period of extraordinary change. The Industrial Revolution, already several generations old, had produced a new kind of wealth, factory money, trade money, the kind of accumulated capital that the Pembertons represent, neither the ancient landed wealth of the aristocracy, nor the modest professional income of the middle classes, but something in between, something with ambition and money, but without the old names and the old connections that money alone could not simply purchase. What it could purchase was everything Eleanor spends on, the clothing and the servants and the dinners and the flowers, the whole elaborate apparatus through which new money was translated, over years and decades, into social standing. And in the centre of this translation project, in the management of every detail of its daily operation, stood the woman, always the woman, the wives and daughters of wealthy Victorian men who did not build the industrial fortunes but who were assigned the task of spending them correctly, of transforming raw financial power into the refined social currency that allowed a family to actually enter the world it had paid to join. This was not acknowledged as skilled work. It was not compensated as skilled work, beyond the household allowance and the personal pin money and the standard of living that came with the position. It was simply expected as the natural function of the woman in a wealthy household, as natural as the expectation that she would bear the children and manage the nursery and be available to her husband and represent the household correctly in every public and private context. And yet the skill required to do it was entirely real. The social intelligence, the organizational capability, the financial acumen, the interpersonal sensitivity, the ability to manage complex systems with multiple moving parts, the ability to do this day after day without formal recognition or external accountability, or anyone asking how it was going. These were genuine abilities applied to a genuinely complex set of tasks, producing genuinely valuable results for the households that benefited from them. What would happen if you tried to replace Eleanor, not as a wife, not as a mother, but specifically as a household and social manager, with someone paid to do those things? A social secretary for the correspondence and the calling cards, a professional household manager for the servants and the accounts, a party planner for the dinner parties, a personal shopper for the clothing, a social consultant for the charity work and the committee obligations. Add these costs together and you arrive at a figure that significantly exceeds what Eleanor costs the household in allowance and expenditure. She is, by any analysis that looks at what she actually produces, a bargain. But she is not thought of this way. She is thought of as an ornament and a helpmate and a social asset and a mother, all of which she is. The economic analysis is never done. The invisible labor is never enumerated. The account book captures what she spends but not what she produces, and what she produces does not appear anywhere in writing. This is one of the more interesting truths that looking at Victorian women's spending reveals. If you are willing to read what the numbers are actually saying rather than simply totaling them up. The rain has softened now, barely there, just a presence in the dark outside. The street lamp casts its orange glow on the wet pavement below Eleanor's window. In the morning, the housemaid will be the first one up, lighting the kitchen fire before anyone else is awake. The coachman will have the horse ready by 8:30. The flowers on the hall table will need to be refreshed. The week's correspondence is already accumulating on the writing desk, but not yet. Not yet. This is the hour that belongs to no one and to nothing. The hour between the end of the evening and the beginning of the morning, when the account book is closed and the social world is genuinely asleep, and the house is simply a house, full of ordinary humans sleeping, ordinary human warmth. Eleanor in her bed, Mary in her room off the dressing room, the children in the nursery 2 floors up, the cook in the basement quarters with her kitchen cold now and the range banked, the butler with his keys on the hook, the parlour maid whose feet ache from the standing, the housemaid who has been saving for 3 years toward the particular future she imagines for herself, which involves leaving service and opening a small tea shop in Ealing with her sister, which she has not told anyone and which she thinks about most nights in the 15 minutes between lying down and sleep. 12 people in one building, each carrying their own private arithmetic of hopes and costs and calculations. Outside, the great Victorian city doing what cities do in the small hours, going on, continuing, rain on stone, horse on cobble, somewhere a door, somewhere a voice, the complex unceasing machinery of a world that never entirely stops even when everyone in it is asleep. £40 a week, one woman, one account book, one Thursday morning of careful review, thousands of small decisions made so naturally that the people who benefited from them would not know if you asked them that any decision had been made at all. This is what it cost to be wealthy in Victorian England. This is what it cost, more precisely, to be a wealthy Victorian woman. Not just the money and everything that the money was doing and everything that had to be done to make the money do it. The morning will come. It always comes. The fires will be lit and the water will be hot and the day will begin again, perfectly managed, perfectly invisible, perfectly Eleanor. Sleep well, my friend. We have been somewhere real tonight, in the rooms and the ledgers and the quiet late hours of a world that understood some things very well and some things barely at all. Somewhere in the middle of all of it, behind the account book and the account it could not quite keep, a woman who was more than the sum of what she spent. The lamp is out. The rain is nearly nothing now. The night is very still. Rest. Let us go back into the daylight hours for a while. Back into the rooms and the rituals and the particular quality of attention that Victorian wealthy life demanded from the women who kept it running. There is something we have not fully explored yet. something that appears in Eleanor's account book as a single line item in a way that obscures how complex it actually is. The clothing she buys not for herself, but for the purposes of giving to others, not as gifts exactly, more as obligations. The very specific Victorian practice of what was called clothing charity, and what it reveals about the social architecture of the period. In 1883, it is an established expectation in households of Eleanor's type that when a servant leaves, particularly a long-serving one, she should receive a gift of clothing from the mistress. Specifically, the mistress's own clothing, worn but not worn out, passed on as a mark of regard and as a practical benefit to a woman whose income does not allow for the kind of clothing her employer wears. Eleanor gives away perhaps 2 or 3 garments a year this way, and she thinks carefully about which garments to give and to whom, because a dress given to a woman who will not be able to wear it appropriately to her own life is not a gift but an awkward burden, and Eleanor is not the kind of woman who gives burdens wrapped as gifts. Mary, her lady's maid, receives the best of Eleanor's outgoing wardrobe, because Mary is the one person in the household whose life as a lady's maid takes her occasionally into public spaces where a well-made dress is appropriate. When Eleanor's plum silk day dress was remade by Madame Lemaire's seamstress with a new bodice 2 years ago, the original bodice, still in good condition, was passed to Mary, who had it combined with a skirt of her own to make a dress that she wears on her afternoons off. This is not noted in the account book. It is simply what is done, but the clothing charity extends beyond the servants. Eleanor is a member of a working women's clothing club in a parish not far from their Belgravia house, run by the vicar's wife and a small committee of women from nearby wealthy households. The principle is straightforward. Members of the club contribute their worn but serviceable clothing several times a year, which is then cleaned, repaired where necessary, and distributed at a nominal price, a penny or 2p per garment, to working women who cannot afford to buy clothing at any other rate. The nominal price is important. Eleanor's vicar's wife has explained more than once, because a gift received without payment carries a social burden that a small purchase does not. A woman who buys something, however cheaply, is a customer. A woman who receives a gift is a recipient of charity, and the difference in how she holds herself afterward is palpable. Eleanor contributes to this club regularly. She does not, however, simply dump her outgoing wardrobe into a box and hand it over. She reviews each garment with the trained eye of someone who knows exactly how a dress looks and wears, assessing what has real useful life remaining, and what has been worn to the point where giving it is simply a way of passing the problem of disposal to someone else. She repairs buttons. She has small tiers stitched before contributing a garment. She considers what kind of woman will receive the thing, and whether it is the kind of thing that will serve her actual life, which for a working woman in the Lambeth parish where the club operates, is a life of physical labour in conditions that bear almost no relationship to the conditions of a Belgravia morning room. This is one of the quieter and more genuinely admirable things about Eleanor. She takes the clothing charity seriously in its practical dimension, not only as a social obligation she performs, but as a thing she actually wants to function. She has on 2 occasions visited the club's distribution days, which is not expected of the contributing members, and which several of the vicar's wife's committee find slightly eccentric, but Eleanor finds it clarifying in a way she does not try to explain to anyone, to occasionally be in a room with the actual results of the good intentions of the social world she inhabits, to see what is actually useful and what is not, to talk briefly and carefully to the women who come, to remember that Belgravia and Lambeth are 3 miles apart and could be on different planets, and that the account book she keeps on Thursday mornings represents a scale of expenditure that most of the women coming through that club's door would find not merely unimaginable but quietly horrifying. She does not voice this reflection in any drawing room. It would not be well received, and in any case she is not sure what conclusion she draws from it, which makes it difficult to share. It simply sits in her, this knowledge, this occasional, deliberate, slightly uncomfortable encounter with a reality that exists outside the world she manages so carefully. Let us turn to something that has been waiting in the wings of this whole conversation, something that the account book and the social calendar and the dinner parties and the dressmaker's bills all circle around without quite addressing. The question of what Eleanor actually wants, not what she does, what she wants. This is a question that the 1880s have very limited language for, in the context of a married woman of Eleanor's class. She is understood to want, the things that her role provides: a well-run household, healthy children, a husband who prospers, a secure social position, good relationships with her social circle. These are understood to be the natural desires of a woman of her station, and they are not pretended wants. Eleanor genuinely cares about these things. They are real parts of her life and real sources of satisfaction when they go well. But, there is a but, and Eleanor knows it in the way she knows the Middlemarch passage, the way she knows the feeling of the second movement of the Brahms symphony, the way she knows why she goes to the Royal Institution lectures on Friday afternoons without telling most of the people she knows. She is, in fact and in private, a person of considerable intellectual scope. She reads things that go beyond what the drawing room requires of her. She thinks about things in more depth than she ever has occasion to voice. She has opinions, genuine and carefully formed opinions, about political questions, about economic questions, about questions of social justice that the charitable work she does brushes up against without quite engaging. She has an opinion about women's education that is considerably more progressive than what she could comfortably express in company. She has been following with private attention the growing public conversation about the expansion of women's educational and professional opportunities, reading the arguments on both sides in the periodicals she subscribes to, finding herself, on the balance, in a place that she cannot quite occupy publicly without significant social cost. She does not think of herself as a radical. She would resist that word. But she is, in the privacy of her morning room and her journal and the late evenings with a book, a woman who knows that the world she inhabits has been built on a set of assumptions about what women are and what women want and what women can do that are not quite right, and who has never had and is not likely to have the space within her actual life to do very much about it. This is not bitterness. It is something more patient and more complicated than bitterness. It is the particular kind of clear-eyed accommodation that very capable people make when they find themselves in containers that are too small for them, and when changing the container is not for the moment available as an option. There is a passage in Eleanor's private journal, written in late October of 1883, shortly after the week we have been following, that I want to share with you in spirit if not in word, because I have been thinking about it since I started thinking about this story. She writes about the concert she attended, the Brahms. She writes about the particular experience of sitting in a concert hall and hearing something that seems to address itself to the most honest part of her, the part that exists without any social function, the part that does not need to be performing or managing or calibrating. She writes about how rare that experience is. She does not write about it with sadness, not exactly. She writes about it with a kind of wry awareness that this is what she has, the concerts and the books and the journal and the late evenings at the piano, and that this is a great deal to have, and that she knows it, and that knowing it is true while also knowing that there is more in her than the life accommodates, both true simultaneously, is something she has learned to live with so thoroughly that it barely hurts anymore. Barely. She closes the journal and locks it and puts the key where it lives. Tomorrow the Thursday account book. Next week the dinner party. The season moving through its obligations, each one managed with care, each one done as well as it can be done. The intelligence and the care and the genuine dedication brought to a life, fully applied to everything it has been given to work with. Let us return one more time to the detail, the texture of it, the particular sensory world that Eleanor's money maintains and that makes the whole project of Victorian wealthy life feel like a specific, real, physical thing rather than an abstraction. The quality of the linens in the Pemberton house. This is something worth sitting with for a moment, because linen of the quality Eleanor maintains is not something most modern people have encountered. Irish damask, woven on power looms but finished by hand, has a weight and a smoothness that comes from the particular way linen behaves at high thread counts, a kind of coolness and a kind of firmness that cotton, however fine, does not replicate. The tablecloths for the dining table, when fresh from the laundry and correctly pressed by the laundrymaid, have a particular smell, slightly sweet, faintly mineral, the smell of clean linen that has been ironed under heat, and they lie on the table with a stillness and a precision that suggests care in a way that nothing about the room quite does as directly. Eleanor's bed linen is the same quality. She has slept on this particular grade of linen long enough that she notices when something is wrong, when a sheet is beginning to thin in the centre from repeated washing, or when the pillowcase has been starched too heavily and feels stiff rather than smooth under her cheek. These are small things. They are the kind of things that are noticed only when they go wrong, never when they are right, which is the definition of a certain kind of quality, the kind that announces itself only by its absence, the fires. In November, the fires in the Pemberton house are burning from the moment the housemaid lights them at 6 in the morning until they are banked for the night at 10 or 11. There are fires in the drawing room, the morning room, the dining room, the library, the master and mistress's bedrooms, the nursery, and Mrs. Barlow, the housekeeper's room. The coal consumption in a London house of this size in November is substantial. The coal merchant delivers twice weekly. The housemaid who carries the coal scuttles up the stairs, filling each grate from the scuttle and removing the ash in the pan below, does this work every morning before the family wakes and again as needed through the day. Eleanor does not see this work, in the sense that she is not present when it is done, but she sees its results in the warmth that greets her when she descends in the morning. The particular warmth of a house where coal fires have been burning for 2 hours already, a warmth that has a slight sulphurous quality from the coal, overlaid by the smell of whatever Mrs. Partridge is cooking in the kitchen below, and by the lavender that Mrs. Barlow puts in the laundry water, which Eleanor can sometimes catch on the freshly pressed linens and curtains. Food. We have talked about food in the context of dinner parties, but the ordinary daily food of the Pemberton household is worth describing on its own terms because it is both more elaborate than we might expect and more conservative than the dinner party menu suggests. Breakfast for the family is a hot meal, always a hot meal. This is 1883, and a hot breakfast is a given for any household with servants to produce it and the budget to maintain it. The sideboard in the morning room has covered dishes, warming on a spirit lamp, containing what Mrs. Partridge has prepared in the kitchen since 6:30, scrambled eggs, devilled kidneys on some mornings, which Mr. Pemberton particularly likes and which Eleanor tolerates, bacon, which is always there, a kedgeree on Fridays, which is an Indian-inspired dish of flaked smoked fish, rice, and hard-cooked eggs that arrived in English cuisine via the servants of the East India Company, and that Eleanor genuinely enjoys in a way she would not necessarily advertise, because fashions in food have shifted since kedgeree's peak of popularity, and it is beginning to seem slightly unfashionable. Toast made at the table in the small silver toast rack, the tea, of course, coffee for Mr. Pemberton, who prefers it to tea in the morning. This breakfast, produced daily 7 days a week, requires Mrs. Partridge and the kitchen maid to be at work by 6. The kitchen fire lit, the water heated, the eggs cooked and the fish flaked and the kidneys prepared. It arrives at the sideboard at 8, covered and warm, and it stays there until the family has finished, which is generally around 9. At which point the kitchen maid clears it away and the process of luncheon preparation begins. Luncheon is lighter. A cold joint if there is one left from the previous day's dinner, some bread and butter, a dish of something simple, cold chicken, potted shrimps, a salad in the summer. This meal often involves Eleanor eating alone or with Cecily, because Mr. Pemberton does not return from his chambers for luncheon on weekday, and Arthur is at school. It is the most informal meal of the day, served without the full dining room ceremony. Sometimes in the morning room, the cover's simple, the service minimal. Tea at 4 o'clock. This is a more social meal in the sense that Eleanor may well have callers during these hours, and tea must be available at any moment from around 3 until 5. The tea is made properly in a warmed silver pot, with leaves measured into the pot and hot water poured over them, and the timing watched so that it steeps without oversteeping, which produces bitterness. There are thin slices of bread and butter, always, and small cakes and biscuits on days when callers are expected. Dinner at 8, the main formal meal of the day, even on days with no guests. This is not the elaborate production of a dinner party, but it is still a formal meal. 3 courses, soup, something, a sweet, served properly at the dining table with the correct silver and the correct linen, Mr. Pemberton at the head and Eleanor on his left. The conversation that of 2 people who know each other's preferences and history and who can talk easily or sit in comfortable silence, which is itself one of the marks of a marriage that has reached a genuine rather than a performed ease. These meals every day sustained by Mrs. Partridge and her kitchen staff represent a continuous investment in a certain standard of daily life that Eleanor considers not a luxury but a baseline. The household runs on its food, the servants work better when they are well fed, the children grow correctly on the nourishment a good cook provides, and the meals around which the family gathers are the daily structure of their life together, the rhythm that keeps the household from becoming simply a set of rooms where people happen to sleep. Let us turn now to something that runs through everything we have been discussing, and that Eleanor thinks about more often than the account book suggests. The question of reputation, and the fragility of it, and the enormous amount of money and effort and care that goes into maintaining something as socially powerful and as easily damaged as a good name. Reputation in 1880s London is not simply a matter of individual conduct, though it is partly that. It is a matter of the accumulated social record of every interaction, every invitation accepted or declined, every dinner given and every dinner attended, every morning call made, every letter written or not written, every charitable association maintained, every visible expenditure and every visible economy. It is a long ledger of social transactions, kept not in any single place but in the aggregate memory of the social circle, constantly updated, constantly subject to interpretation. A woman's reputation is more fragile than a man's in ways that the period accepts as natural, and that Eleanor does not question, because they have been the conditions of her life since she was old enough to understand what conditions meant. A man's reputation survives most things, short of genuine criminal scandal. A woman's reputation is a more delicate instrument, one that can be damaged by association, by rumour, by a single wrong step at the wrong moment, by the particular kind of malice that the social world occasionally directs at women who have risen quickly, or who have enemies they may not even know they have. Eleanor has no enemies, so far as she knows, but she does not assume she has none. The absence of known enemies is simply the baseline, the work of maintaining good standing with the people who matter, of managing her social relationships with consistent attention and consistent care, of never giving anyone with an unkind disposition a particular thing to say about the Pemberton household. This work is part of why she does what she does with the thoroughness she brings to it. The fear of the damaged reputation is one of the less pleasant but entirely real parts of Eleanor's inner life. She does not wake in the night worrying about it, because she has done nothing to invite it, and she manages her household and her social life with a professionalism that gives very little to work with, but it is there as a background awareness, a kind of vigilance that never completely rests. This is the cost that does not appear in the account book at all. The cost of always being careful, of managing not only what you do but how what you do might appear, of never quite relaxing the awareness that the social world is watching, and that the watching is not always benign. Let us think about this from a different angle. Let us think about what happens when Eleanor encounters a woman whose social position is similar to her own, but whose spending is visibly wrong in one direction or another. Because this kind of comparative social reading is something Eleanor does constantly, and that tells us a great deal about the period's social logic. There is a woman in Eleanor's wider social circle, the wife of a newly prosperous solicitor, who has been making what the social world around Eleanor would recognize as errors, not large ones, small ones. The kind of errors that only a trained eye notices and that add up, over time, to an impression of someone who does not quite know what she is doing. The dress at the wrong occasion. Not a bad dress. A perfectly good dress, well made, fashionable, wrong. Worn to a morning call when it belongs at an afternoon occasion. The gloves not quite fresh enough. The card not left at the correct moment in the visit. Pulled out a fraction too early, suggesting eagerness rather than ease. The comment at a dinner party that is too direct, too personal, too lacking in the particular obliqueness that managing a social conversation in the 1880s requires. The thank you note that arrives a week after the occasion, not the 2 days that is the minimum. Each of these things alone is nothing. Together they create an impression, and the impression spread through the aggregate social memory that Eleanor and her circle maintain is of a woman who is trying but not quite arriving, a woman who has the money but not the knowledge, a woman who is, to use the period's precise and unkind vocabulary, not quite. Eleanor does not dislike this woman. She is actually, in the brief moments when they are directly in conversation, someone Eleanor finds quite interesting, someone with a directness and a genuine humour that the more established women in the circle have smoothed away over years of social management. But Eleanor cannot save her from the impression she is making. She could not even try, because to do so would be to demonstrate an awareness of the errors that is itself a social problem, and in any case it is not her responsibility. Each woman navigates this world as best she can with the tools she has been given. What Eleanor does privately is to feel the old awareness of how close the line is, how much of her own secure position rests on knowledge she absorbed so early and so completely that it feels like instinct, and how easily, in circumstances only slightly different, she might have been the woman not quite getting it right. This thought is not comfortable. She does not dwell on it, but she does not avoid it entirely either, because avoiding it would be a kind of dishonesty about her own situation that she does not permit herself. Now, let us soften the room a little. Let the pace go slower. We are coming toward the end of Eleanor's November day and the end of our time in this world, and it feels right to move through the last hours at the pace the hours themselves suggest. It is an ordinary Thursday evening, not a dinner party night, not a social occasion of any kind. Mr. Pemberton is at his club. The children are in the nursery. The servants are going through the routines of the late evening. The housekeeper reviewing the next day's provisions with the cook. The parlour-maid setting the breakfast things so that nothing must be done in a rush in the morning. Eleanor is alone in the morning room. She has been reading for an hour the Trollope novel, reaching a passage that she wants to read twice, which she does. The lamp on the table casts a warm circle of light, and she sits well inside it. The fire is good. It is quiet enough that she can hear the clock on the mantelpiece. She puts the book down after a while and simply sits, which is something she almost never allows herself without something in her hands. A book, a piece of embroidery, the household correspondence, something that justifies the sitting. Tonight she simply sits. The room is very familiar. She chose everything in it. The 2 small watercolours on the near wall, bought at the Grosvenor Gallery private view 2 years ago from an artist she found interesting, whose handling of light she could not stop looking at. The small rosewood writing desk by the window where her letters live. The carpet, a soft dark rose, bought the first year they came to this house, and showing no sign of wear because she chose well. The curtains, heavy deep green velvet, that she had lined with a second layer of flannel after the first winter here, made it clear that the windows of this room were colder than they looked. She knows every object in this room. She knows the weight of everything, the way the morning light crosses the carpet in different seasons, the precise sound the floorboards make at the threshold of the door. This is her room in a way that no other room in the house quite is, though she manages them all and considers them all her responsibility. The fire settles, a coal shifts, and the flames move differently for a moment. There is a thought that comes to Eleanor sometimes in these quiet moments. Not a worrying thought, just an observing one. She thinks about the women who will live in this room after her. Not specifically, she knows nothing about who they will be, but she knows that rooms like this have a kind of continuity, that they pass from family to family, each family leaving something of themselves in the walls and the decisions, the choice of this carpet rather than another one, the placement of the desk by the window, the hooks added to the back of the door by a woman she will never meet and who had particular notions about where her outdoor things should hang. She wonders sometimes what they will leave. What will remain after Eleanor herself is gone from this room, which will happen eventually one way or another. This is not a melancholy thought, it is a large one, and she holds it for a moment in the way you hold something large, carefully, without gripping too hard. Then she picks up the Trollope novel and reads for another half hour, and the passage she wanted to read twice she reads a third time, slowly, and it is as good the third time as it was the first. At 9:30 she hears Mr. Pemberton's carriage in the street below, and puts the book down with a marker at the page. She goes out to meet him in the hall, and they stand there for a moment in the warmth of the house, both of them tired in slightly different ways, both of them pleased in their particular ways to see the other. He tells her something about his evening, she tells him something about hers. It is a brief exchange and an honest one. Upstairs, the routine of the night, Mary with the lamp and the corset laces and the hairpins into their dish, the cold cream, the braid, the nightgown, the window cracked exactly the right amount for air without cold, because Eleanor has found through experiment the precise opening that gives fresh air without a draught. Mary withdraws. The lamp goes out. The Pemberton house in Belgravia settles into its nighttime state, warm and still, and held together by the daily investment of care and attention and money that Eleanor brings to it from one Thursday account book to the next. Outside, the city carries on in its way, the gas lamps burning, the last late carriages, the rain that has started again, very soft, barely there. Inside, 12 people and a household cat, who has no entry in the account book, but who has lived here for 4 years and who sleeps, tonight, curled on the chair outside the nursery door, the warm and the still and the particular quality of a house that has been looked after. This is what the £40 a week buys, not just the dress and the flowers and the servants' wages. All of that, yes, but underneath all of that, this, the warmth, the stillness, the sense that the house is held. Eleanor sleeps, and here we are at the end of this long November evening in Belgravia, my friend. We have followed the money and found underneath it a life. The account book and the woman behind it, the social project and the person managing it, the extraordinary competence applied to a world that did not know how to acknowledge it as extraordinary. I think about Eleanor sometimes when I consider how differently the Victorian period looked depending on where you stood inside it. From the outside, from the social world's polished surface, it looks like ease and wealth and the comfortable automatic rightness of everything. From the inside, from the Thursday morning with the account book, it looks like something much more complicated. A performance of effortlessness maintained at significant cost, a skill applied daily without recognition, a life genuinely full and genuinely constrained at the same time, in proportions that shifted depending on the day. The £40 a week was real. The skill required to spend it correctly was real. The social world it maintained was real and consequential in the lives of the people the Pemberton household touched. And the person doing the maintaining, the woman with the account book and the private journal and the Brahms symphony in her head and the passage in the Trollope novel she wanted to read 3 times, that person was real too. More real, perhaps, than anything else in the account book. The rain is very soft now. London in November 1883. The gas lamps making orange circles on the wet pavement outside. The house quiet. The fire ash. Somewhere in the city, a woman is making tea by lamplight, going over something in her mind that no one else can see. Somewhere else, a woman is sitting in her morning room with a book open and a fire going, and 30 minutes before the household needs her again, and she is using every second of those 30 minutes to be somewhere entirely her own. Somewhere else, a housemaid is adding up her savings for the third time this week to see if the number has changed, which it has not, but looking at it is something. All these private arithmetics, all these interior accounts that no ledger captures. Sleep, my friend. You have been somewhere real tonight, somewhere that cost a great deal to build and a great deal to maintain, and that, for all of that, for all the money and the management and the social precision and the invisible labor, was still, underneath everything, just a house, just people, just the ordinary human project of making a life and holding it together as best you can with the tools you have been given. The lamps are going out on the street. The night is still and soft and very dark. Rest now. We will be here when the morning comes. Before we drift too far into sleep, let me take you somewhere else for a while. A different house in a different part of London, not Belgravia. Let us go to Kensington, which is slightly less grand in the particular hierarchy of 1880s London addresses, but which is ambitious and comfortable and home to a different kind of wealthy woman than Eleanor, one whose money is older but whose social position is actually more secure because of it, which means the spending is different in ways that are interesting to follow. Her name is, let us say, Lady Ashmore. She is 52 years old. Her husband, Sir Edmund Ashmore, inherited his baronetcy from a father who inherited it from a grandfather, which means the title has been in the family long enough to have lost any sense of novelty or effort. Lady Ashmore has been Lady Ashmore for 23 years. She has 3 grown children, all launched, all settled. The oldest son managing the family's country estate in Wiltshire, the daughter married to a judge in Edinburgh, the younger son in the diplomatic service in Vienna. The Kensington house is her London base, and she spends less time in it than she once did, preferring the country house through the summer and well into autumn, coming to London for the season and for particular reasons. Lady Ashmore's spending is different from Eleanor's in one fundamental and immediately obvious way. Where Eleanor's spending is strategic, consciously directed toward a social goal she is actively working to achieve, Lady Ashmore's spending is simply the maintenance of a position that is already secured and does not need to be worked for in the same active way. This is the difference between new money and old money, which is not, as people sometimes think, primarily about the amount. It is about the relationship to effort. Eleanor needs the right dinner party to advance something. Lady Ashmore gives dinner parties because she enjoys them. The distinction, small as it might sound, changes the entire emotional character of the spending. Lady Ashmore's clothing budget is actually somewhat less than Eleanor's, which surprises people when they hear it. She spends perhaps £600 a year on clothing, considerably less per piece than Madame Le Maire charges, because she uses a dressmaker who has been dressing her for 30 years and who charges her a fair rate rather than a fashionable one, and whose judgment she trusts so completely that she sometimes simply sends a note saying what she needs and receives exactly the right thing without a single fitting. This is what 30 years of established relationship produces, and it is not available at any price to Eleanor, who is still in the relatively early stages of these long professional relationships. Lady Ashmore's house is older and less perfectly managed than the Pemberton house. This is also interesting. There are carpets in 2 of the guest rooms that should have been replaced 2 years ago. The drawing room curtains, a dark gold silk damask that was very handsome when new, are beginning to show their age in the morning light. These things exist in Lady Ashmore's house without causing her any anxiety at all, because her position is solid enough that worn carpets in guest rooms are simply worn carpets, which could be replaced when she gets around to having them replaced, and which do not communicate any social information that she needs to worry about. If Eleanor had worn carpets in her guest rooms, they would communicate vulnerability. In Lady Ashmore's house, they communicate confidence so complete it borders on indifference. This is one of the more interesting things about the very secure, wealthy woman in Victorian London. She can afford, in a social sense, certain kinds of imperfection that the less secure woman cannot. She can wear last season's dress at a social occasion of moderate importance, and have it noted as confident eccentricity rather than financial difficulty. She can decline invitations without careful calculation of the cost of declining, because her presence is known to be valuable, and the occasional absence only reinforces this. She can express an opinion in company that is sharper or more personal than the usual drawing room register, and have it received as character rather than bad manners. All of these freedoms are freedoms of position, freedoms that Eleanor's money has not yet fully purchased for her, and that may not be fully available to her within this generation. Lady Ashmore also spends differently in a more literal sense. She spends a significant portion of her personal allowance on travel, which Eleanor does almost none of. Lady Ashmore has been to Rome 3 times, to Florence twice, once to Greece, which was considered slightly adventurous for a woman of her class and generation, and once to Egypt, which she undertook at 49 with a friend, and which she considers privately one of the better decisions of her adult life. Each of these journeys cost money, in the obvious sense of the passage and the accommodation and the services of a courier who arranged the practicalities, but they also cost something less obvious, the full price of a life temporarily set down, the house in Kensington running without her, the servants managing as they always do when she is absent, the social calendar, briefly, a thing that is happening elsewhere and without her, which is a feeling she has learned, in her 50s, to find rather pleasant. The journey to Egypt cost her approximately £350, including everything. She does not regret a single shilling of it. She came back with a piece of alabaster she bought in a market in Cairo for less than £1, and which now sits on her writing desk, and which she finds she likes to hold sometimes when she is reading. Turning it in her hands, the weight and the smoothness of it, it does not match anything else in the room. She has not been able to decide whether to put it somewhere more prominent or leave it where it is. Currently it is where it is. Something I want to return to, because we touched on it briefly and I think it deserves more time, is the specific question of what wealthy Victorian women spent on what we would now call self-care, in the wider sense of the things done for the body and the mind in the privacy of the household, away from the social performance. The Victorian bath is worth describing properly. The bath, taken 2 or 3 times a week, was not the quick hot shower of modern life. It was an event in the way that the rich Victorian Totti Exti reference tells us, requiring hot water carried up from the kitchen, the copper bathtub that most houses of any status maintained in a separate bathroom, and a careful management of temperature that the maid, or, in less staffed households, the woman herself, administered with the addition of hot water from the jug kept warming by the fire. Eleanor's bath takes place on Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday. The ritual begins with Mary carrying the first large copper jug of hot water from the kitchen, which has been heated on the range from early morning precisely for this purpose. 3 to 4 jugs, each poured carefully into the tub, adjusted with cold water until the temperature is correct, which Eleanor prefers on the warmer end of comfortable, the kind of heat that requires a moment of adjustment on entering. The tub is a large oval copper thing, set on wooden feet, in a room that Eleanor fitted out specifically for its purpose when they came to the house, with a good coal fire and adequate hooks for the towels and the dressing gown, and a small table for the soap and the bath sponge and the bath salts she has sent to her twice yearly from a pharmacist in Bath, who produces them in a lavender formulation that she has been using for 7 years. The bath itself lasts between 20 minutes and half an hour. This is not the quick functional wash of necessity, but a deliberate pause in the day, a ritual of warmth and water, and a particular quality of physical calm that comes when the body is surrounded by warm water, and the room is heated and there is nothing immediately required of anyone. Eleanor reads in the bath, which is a habit she developed young and has never given up, keeping a book on the table beside the tub, the pages occasionally warped by steam, which she minds less than she minds not having something to read. The soap she uses is milled Castile, imported from Spain via an importer in the city, slightly expensive, nothing elaborate. The bath sponge is natural sea sponge, also through the same importer. The bath salts dissolve into the water and leave her skin feeling different in a way that is difficult to describe, something slightly smoother. The tension of the day dissolved as much as the salt. She has no scientific understanding of why this works, but it clearly does, and she has no particular need to understand the mechanism when the result is available. After the bath, wrapped in the large Turkish towel that is reserved for this purpose and that Mary has warmed by the fire before she came in, Eleanor sometimes simply sits by the fire for a few minutes in a way that she cannot sit anywhere else in the household without something in her hands. This is the closest thing to rest that her waking hours contain, a physical ease so complete that the usual background running of plans and obligations quiets temporarily, and there is just the warmth and the firelight and the sound of the coal and the steam rising off her skin. Then Mary brings the dressing gown and the morning resumes. This 15 or 20 minutes, 3 times a week, is the most purely personal expenditure in Eleanor's entire schedule. The bath itself is not particularly expensive. The soap and the salts and the sponge together cost perhaps £1 a month. The real cost is the time, the hot water, Mary's labour in managing it. But the return in terms of what it does for Eleanor's capacity to keep doing what she does at the level she does it is not nothing. It is in fact rather a lot. Let us spend some time now in the country house, because wealthy Victorian women's spending was not confined to London, and the country house season reveals a different set of expenditures and a different set of social obligations that are as interesting as the London ones. The Pembertons do not have a country house of their own yet. This is in fact one of the markers that distinguishes them from the fully established wealthy class, rather than the aspirant wealthy class. A London house and a country house together is the combination that signals a certain arrival. Mr. Pemberton intends to purchase a suitable property within the next several years, when his business position is sufficiently solid to support it without visible financial strain. Eleanor is aware of this plan and has opinions about it, specifically about what kind of country house, in what county, at what distance from London, would best serve the family's purposes. Her opinions are the result of considerable research and social intelligence gathering, conducted so naturally over the past several years that no one in her social circle would know she is doing it. In the meantime, the Pembertons take a house in the country for August and September, which is done through an agent who manages a portfolio of suitable furnished properties for exactly this purpose. They have used the same agent for 3 years, and the current house, a medium-sized Georgian manor in Surrey, comfortable and decently staffed with its own servants in place, costs them £95 for the 2 months, which is at the mid-range of what such houses command. Eleanor contributes her own lady's maid to the establishment, bringing Mary down from London, because there are things about Eleanor's daily routine and Eleanor's hair and Eleanor's preferences in the management of her dressing room that she does not want to explain to a temporary maid. The country house social world is different from London's in its rhythms, more relaxed in some ways and more continuous in others. There are no morning calls in the strict London sense because the country visiting is more casual and longer. People drop in for luncheon without formal notice, which would be impossible in London but which is perfectly acceptable in the country. There are shooting parties in the autumn, which involve specific obligations for the women of the household, feeding and entertaining a larger group of guests over several days, managing the house at a scale that the regular household staff of a rented property is not accustomed to, which requires Eleanor to bring in additional help from the local village and to manage those additional people within the first day. The social expenditure in the country differs from London in that it is more food-heavy and less clothing-heavy. A country house luncheon for 10 guests costs in food perhaps £3 and has less requirement for elaborate presentation than a London dinner. Eleanor can appear at a country luncheon in a walking dress rather than an afternoon visiting dress, and have it be entirely correct, which is one of the genuine relaxations of the country house season. The clothes she brings to the country are comfortable and practical by London standards. She brings her good things in case they are needed for something more formal, but the daily standard is lower, the wardrobe lighter, the hair less elaborately dressed. She also walks more in the country. This is not a small thing. Eleanor in London walks between the carriage and the door of wherever she is going, and occasionally in the park in the morning, which requires appropriate costume for the park and is itself a social activity. In Surrey, she walks across fields and through the lanes around the village in a way that has no social function and no social audience. just the physical fact of her body moving through air and landscape. She finds this, and she has noticed this about herself, somewhat necessary. The specific kind of tiredness that accumulates in London, the social tiredness, the managed air and managed face tiredness, does not dissolve in baths and concerts the way the walking dissolves it. It needs something that has no audience at all. She takes these walks with only Mary, or sometimes entirely alone, which raises eyebrows among some of the local people who see her and who are accustomed to seeing wealthy women walking with companions or with a dog at minimum. Eleanor has a distant manner in these moments that discourages approach without being unfriendly, a kind of self-contained presence that she has developed over years of wanting to be in her own thoughts and having few other opportunities for it. She looks at things on these walks. The way the light falls on a particular field in early September, amber and low and very long shadowed, the arrangement of a stand of trees, the smell of mud after rain, the sound a wood pigeon makes that she finds, for no reason she can quite articulate, more calming than almost any other sound she knows. She thinks on these walks in a different way than she thinks in the morning room or at the writing desk, more loosely, less directed. Things arrive in her mind without being summoned and depart without being resolved, and she lets them, which is something the London version of Eleanor would not permit. These walks cost nothing. They are in a budget that accounts for almost every expenditure of Eleanor's life, the one free thing. Let us think now about the women at the periphery of Eleanor's world, the women whose lives intersected with the wealthy woman's household spending without being part of it, the tradeswomen and the shopwomen, and the women who worked in the establishments where Eleanor spent her money, who form an invisible but essential part of the economic picture. At Madame Lemaire's establishment in South Audley Street, there are 11 women employed in the workroom above the showroom. They are seamstresses and embroiderers and fitters, ranging in age from 17 to 43, and their working conditions are, by modern standards, very difficult, and by the standards of the 1880s, average to somewhat better than average for the trade. They work from 8 in the morning until 6 or 7 in the evening, sometimes later during the busy season, which is the weeks before major social events, the season in early summer, the Christmas period, the months of heavy autumn social activity that generate the rush of orders that Eleanor's November fittings are part of. The lead seamstress, a woman of 37 who has been at Madame Lemaire's for 11 years, earns 14 shillings a week. The junior seamstresses earn between 7 and 10 shillings. They sit at long tables in a room with north-facing windows for the quality of the light, bent over the fine fabrics, their hands moving with a trained precision that Eleanor has occasionally glimpsed when she is shown through to the fitting room, though she does not linger. The lead seamstress's hands are remarkable things, strong and deft and slightly reddened at the knuckles from the cold of the workroom in winter, because Madame Lemaire does not heat the workroom as well as she heats the showroom, which is where the money is. These women's labour is what makes Eleanor's dress. The thousands of small stitches in the bodice lining, the jet beading, applied one bead at a time, the seaming of the skirt panels, perfectly aligned, the finishing of the hem, done by hand in a running stitch so fine it is invisible from any normal distance. All of this is inside the dark silk dress that Eleanor is wearing when she moves through her drawing room at a dinner party, feeling the quality of it and the rightness of it in a way that is real and genuine. The gap between the feeling and its origin, in the cold workroom and the 14 shillings a week and the reddened hands, is one of the fundamental conditions of the social world Eleanor inhabits. She is aware of it, in the general way that intelligent people of her period are aware of the labour behind their comfort, without being able to do much about it within the individual choices available to them. She pays Madame Lemaire's bills promptly, which matters for the small business's cash flow and which she is aware matters. She treats the fitters and the assistants she encounters at Madame Lemaire's with courtesy, which is both genuinely natural to her and not universally practiced by women of her class, some of whom treat the women serving them with a disregard that Eleanor finds both wrong and, practically speaking, pointless. A fitter who respects you will tell you when something is not right. A fitter who has been treated poorly will tell you only what she thinks you want to hear. Beyond the dressmaker's workroom, there are the laundry women who do the household's large washing, which is sent out on Mondays and returned on Fridays. The laundry, a commercial one in a nearby street, employs 12 women, working the same long hours in significantly more physically demanding conditions. Laundering the quantity of linen and clothing that a household of Eleanor's size produces is heavy work. Hot water, steam, the physical effort of wringing and lifting and pressing, the chemical hazard of the washing compounds. The women who do this work are paid at piece rate, roughly equivalent to 8 to 10 shillings a week for an experienced laundress, and they are very good at it, because the standard of laundering that Eleanor's household expects is high, and the laundry's continued custom depends on meeting it. Eleanor does not think about the laundry women most of the time. The laundry is collected and returned, and the household linen arrives back clean and pressed, and she notes that it has been done well, or notes when something has not been returned in the right condition, and raises it with Mrs. Barlow, who raises it with the laundry. This is the efficient management of an outsourced service, and it looks from the account book like a simple expense item, £2.15 a month, which it is. It is also underneath that number, 12 women's working lives. The flower seller from whom Eleanor's florist sources part of his stock works from a barrow in the street 2 blocks east. She is up before 5 in the mornings when she works, going to Covent Garden for the day's flowers, loading the barrow, pushing it to her pitch, selling from 6 in the morning until the stock is gone, then returning for the next day's flowers. She earns on a good week around 8 shillings, on a bad week considerably less. She has no access to the credit economy that Eleanor navigates so naturally, no account at a linen draper, no quarterly settlement with a wine merchant. Everything she buys is paid for in cash at the time of purchase, because cash at the time of purchase is the only available option. I am not drawing this out to make Eleanor feel guilty by contrast. She would not benefit from the guilt, and neither would the flower seller. I am drawing it out because the spending of wealthy Victorian women existed in a specific economic ecosystem, and you cannot understand the spending without understanding the ecosystem, and you cannot understand the ecosystem without seeing all its parts, not just the comfortable ones. The economic world of 1880s London was one of extraordinary and visible inequality, inequality more stark than what most modern Western cities contain, and that inequality was, in various ways, the condition that made Eleanor's life possible. The very cheapness of domestic service, the very cheapness of skilled labour in a world where skilled labour had few protections, the very cheapness of the linen and the dress fabric and the coal and the food, all of it underpriced in the way that things are underpriced when the people doing the work have no leverage to ask for more. Eleanor knows this. She is not a stupid woman. She has read enough of the periodicals, attended enough committee meetings about the conditions of the working poor, been to the clothing club distribution days, to know the rough shape of the world her comfortable life rests on. What she does not know, what no one in her world can clearly see, is what to do about it in any systemic sense. The charitable work helps at the edges. The committee work raises money for specific needs. The treating of servants with decency is, within the terms of the system, as much as can be done. The system itself, the wages and the conditions and the structural inequality, those are things that individuals within the system cannot unilaterally change, and Eleanor is realistic enough about power and change to know that expressing personal distress about them in company would produce nothing except social awkwardness. She is, in this as in other things, a person of her time, a thoughtful, perceptive, genuinely good person of her time, which is a different thing from being a revolutionary and not something to be ashamed of. Come back now to the quieter things. Let the larger thoughts rest for a while, and let us sit with Eleanor in the smaller details one more time. She has a particular chair in the morning room that she has occupied for 6 years. It is a low-seated chair upholstered in a faded green, the original fresh colour of which she can still see in the fabric behind the cushion where the light does not reach. She bought it at auction the year they came to the house because it was priced below what she suspected it was worth. And she was right, it has turned out to be more comfortable than any other chair she owns. The seat the right height for her, the back the right angle, the cushions soft without being formless. She has thought occasionally about having it reupholstered, because the green is wearing at the arms in a way that is beginning to be visible. She has not done this. She does not quite want to yet. The chair and the cold cream and the £40 week and the Thursday account book and the private journal and the 3 readings of the Trollope passage and the Brahms symphony in the back of her mind. These are the real things. These are what the money is maintaining, and what the money cannot quite capture, and what the account book, ledger though it is of an entire social world, somehow fails to record. Eleanor Pemberton of Belgravia, 1883, managing her household and her social world and her private self with equal parts competence and invisibility. She is very good at all of it. She is more than all of it. Both things true, both things hers. The night outside the window has gone fully dark, fully still. London in winter moves toward midnight with a particular quality of sound, the late traffic thinning, the horses' hooves on the wet stone becoming occasional rather than continuous, the gas lamps beginning to flicker slightly in the cold. Inside the house everything is done, the fires banked, the covers laid for tomorrow's breakfast, the carriage in the mews and the horse in his stall, the silver in its case, the account book closed. Eleanor is asleep in her bed in the Belgravia house. Mary is asleep in her room off the dressing room. The children are asleep in the nursery. Mr. Pemberton is asleep in his dressing room, as is the habit of the late Victorian period, when the master and mistress maintain separate sleeping and dressing arrangements. The servants are asleep in their rooms, all except the night porter who sits by the front door until 2 in the morning as the household's standard security arrangement, and who is, as it happens, currently asleep in his chair. Everything is still. In the morning it will begin again, as it always begins. The housemaid with the coal scuttle, the kitchen fire, the warm water in the jug, Mary at the door with the lamp, Eleanor in the dim morning dark, reviewing the day in her mind before it begins, running through its obligations with a general's quiet assessment of what is needed and what she has to bring to it. And she has a great deal to bring to it. She always does. That has always been the real story, underneath the account book, and the £40, and the silk dress, and the social project, and all of it. The person who brings what she brings to every single day of a life that does not quite ask for everything she has to give. I find myself thinking about her still, this imaginary real woman, this composite of everything I have read about wealthy Victorian women's lives and spending and the particular quality of their days. I find myself hoping, in the way you hope for characters you have spent time with, that the walks in the Surrey lanes were long enough, that the concerts were as good as the best one, that the evenings at the piano in an empty drawing room felt like enough, often enough, that the Middlemarch passage about the window, which she read and kept returning to and never shared with anyone, that it was the particular comfort that those passages can be, the recognition that someone else has seen the thing you thought you were seeing alone. We do not get to know. That is the nature of history, and the particular nature of the interior lives of Victorian women, whose private selves are the most under-archived thing in an era that produced extraordinary archives of almost everything else. What we have is the account book, the dress receipts, the charity subscription lists, the letters that were kept, which are the social letters rather than the true ones, the photographs in which they sit still and composed and slightly other to themselves in the long exposure. These are what remain, and they are real things, and they tell us genuinely interesting things about the world those women occupied. But they do not tell us what Eleanor thought about on the Surrey walks, what the Brahms sounded like to her in the quiet of the concert hall, what she wrote in the journal that no one will ever read. That part is gone. We can imagine it. We can guess with the imprecision and the care that good historical guessing requires, but we cannot know it. And maybe that is right. Maybe some things belong to the person who thought them, and the account book can have the rest. The lamps are out, the street is empty, the rain has stopped completely now, and the night is perfectly clear and very cold. You can see, from the Belgravia rooftops, the particular winter stars of a London sky cleared by the temperature, hard and bright, and very far away. Sleep, my friend. The night is deep and the house is warm and the account book is closed. We have been somewhere real tonight. Rest now, gently, all the way down into sleep. The fire is ash. The world outside is still. You are warm, and the night is long, and the morning is far away. Let it be far away. Let it stay far away for a while. Rest. There is one more thing I want to tell you before the night is fully over. One more detail that I have been carrying since I first came across it. The kind of small, specific human detail that somehow holds more of the truth than anything grand or sweeping. In the archives of a London museum, there is a small leather-bound account book. It belonged to a wealthy Victorian woman in the 1880s, a real woman whose name has been kept private by the museum at the family's request. The book covers 3 years of her household spending, week by week, in handwriting that changes almost imperceptibly over the period, getting very slightly looser toward the last entries, the pen pressure lighter, as if whoever held it was tired, or was simply less interested in impressing the page than she had once been. Most of the entries are exactly what you would expect: the dressmaker, the servant's wages, the household food, the coachman, the charity subscriptions, the coal, the wine. But in the margin of one page, in the same handwriting but in a different ink, smaller, written not as an account entry but as a private annotation, there are 4 words. They are not a figure or a category or a supplier's name. They are just 4 words, written in the margin of a household account book in 1886. The words are, "Also the quiet mornings." Nothing explains them. There is no context. They sit in the margin of a page recording the household spending for the 3rd week of March in 1886, and then they do not appear again. Also the quiet mornings. I think about this sometimes. What was she accounting for, this anonymous woman with the lightening pen pressure, when she wrote that in the margin? Was she keeping a different kind of account, a private one, tallying not what was spent but what was kept? The quiet mornings that belong to no social obligation and no household requirement and no one else. The small mornings that were only hers. Maybe, or maybe it was something else entirely. We do not know and cannot know. But it has stayed with me since the first time I read it, and I am glad it has. It seems to me to be the truest entry in the whole account book. Not the £40, not the dress, not the dinner for 14. Also the quiet mornings. Those too. Those were part of what the life contained, even if no ledger was designed to hold them. Sleep well, my friend. The room is warm and the night is good, and somewhere, in the margin of an old account book in a London museum, a woman kept her own private tally, also the quiet mornings. Rest, and if you are still here, still awake at this edge of sleep, let me leave you with one last thought about Eleanor and the world she lived in, about what it meant to be a wealthy woman in Victorian England, not in the general sense of comfort and privilege which were real, but in the specific sense of what that comfort cost and what the privilege required, and what remained when all of that was accounted for. The Victorian period is often understood, from our distance, as a time of certainty, fixed hierarchies, known rules, a world in which everyone knew their place and the place was maintained with a rigidity we can barely imagine now. And there is truth in this. The social rules Eleanor navigated were real and they were enforced, not by any formal mechanism but by the continuous low pressure of collective social opinion, which is in its own way more effective than any formal rule because it is everywhere and has no appeal. But inside that certainty, inside the rigidity, the women who lived in the wealthy households of 1880s London were navigating something considerably more uncertain than the exterior suggests: the anxiety of position not yet fully secured, the knowledge that the social world could take back what it had given, the awareness growing through the decade that things were changing, that the world was not as fixed as it appeared, that the conversations about women's education and women's rights and women's professional lives that were being conducted in the very periodicals Eleanor read on quiet Thursday afternoons were not abstract conversations happening somewhere else, but were about the specific conditions of her own specific life. The 1880s were, in retrospect, the beginning of a transformation so complete that Eleanor at 34 could not have imagined its eventual destination. Within her lifetime, she would see the first women admitted to medical practice in Britain, the first women elected to local councils, the first serious parliamentary debates about women's suffrage, the gradual opening of certain professions, the slow shift in what was considered appropriate for women to know and do and want. None of these changes would fully arrive within Eleanor's lifetime. She would not live to see women vote, but she would see enough to know that the world she had spent her life managing was not the final word on what the world could be. What she would do with that knowledge, how she would hold it alongside the account book and the dinner parties and the £40 a week, I cannot say. I can guess from everything I know of her that she would hold it thoughtfully, without bitterness, with the specific, clear-eyed realism that runs through her whole character, that she would continue to do the work she was doing because it was real work and the household required it and she was genuinely good at it, that she would continue to take the Surrey walks, to read the Trollope, to go to the Royal Institution lectures on Friday afternoons, sitting quietly in the back and taking it all in, contributing nothing aloud and carrying everything home in her mind, that she would write in the journal, that she would lock it and keep the key where only she knew it was, that she would, in the small marginal hours of a life well and faithfully maintained, keep her own accounts of the things the ledger could not hold, the stars over Belgravia, very clear and very cold, the empty street, the still house, the breathing world. Sleep, my friend, sleep deeply and well and long. We have been somewhere real tonight.